I woke up that morning with a peculiar mixture of excitement and apprehension. Our family trip to Dahil and Bukidnon Park had been planned for months, and now the day had finally arrived. My cousins and I were crammed into the back of Uncle Joey's large SUV, competing good-naturedly for the coveted window seats. We had packed an abundance of snacks, created several playlists of our favorite music, and possessed all the naive optimism typical of travelers setting out on what should have been a straightforward journey. The morning sky stretched above us in an expanse of brilliant blue, almost painful to look at directly. My uncle adjusted the GPS system mounted on the dashboard, entering our destination with confident taps of his finger. Aunt Vera occupied the passenger seat, her dark hair neatly pulled back, occasionally glancing at her phone to verify the route. In retrospect, our excessive reliance on technology foreshadowed the troubles that would soon unfold. "We should arrive by early afternoon," Uncle Joey announced, his voice filled with the assurance of someone who believed modern navigation systems were infallible. "The weather forecast is perfect." My cousins Judy, age 16, and the twins Chris and Kevin, both 14, nodded in agreement, their faces illuminated by the screens of their devices. I, at 17, was the oldest of the group and felt a subtle responsibility for them, though I couldn't have anticipated how significant that sense of duty would become in the hours ahead. As we pulled away from our neighborhood and merged onto the highway, the familiar landscape gradually gave way to more rural surroundings. Fields of tall grass and scattered farmhouses dotted the countryside. The conversation in the vehicle flowed easily, punctuated by laughter and the occasional debate about which snacks to open first. "Did you bring the trail maps?" Aunt Vera asked, turning to look at me. I patted my backpack. "Got them right here. Plus I downloaded the park guide to my phone, just in case." She smiled approvingly. "Always prepared. That's why we brought you along." If only preparation had been enough for what awaited us. The first sign of trouble emerged approximately 3 hours into our journey. The well-maintained highway had gradually narrowed, and the GPS directed us onto an even smaller road that wound through increasingly dense vegetation. Initially, this transition seemed like a scenic detour, perhaps a shortcut known only to locals and sophisticated navigation systems. "This doesn't look right," Aunt Vera murmured, leaning forward to examine the GPS screen more closely. She spoke softly in Cebuano, her native dialect, but I caught enough to understand her concern. "Joey, maybe we should check another map." Uncle Joey maintained his characteristic confidence. "The GPS knows what it's doing. This is probably just a faster route than the main road." I watched as the sunlight filtering through the canopy of trees created dancing patterns on the dashboard. The pleasant morning warmth had given way to a more oppressive humidity, and I noticed Judy shifting uncomfortably beside me. "How much longer?" she asked. Her earlier enthusiasm noticeably diminished. "Not far now," Uncle Joey replied, though I detected a hint of uncertainty in his voice. The road continued to narrow, and the smooth asphalt transitioned to a rougher surface that caused the SUV to vibrate continuously. The lush forest pressed in from both sides, creating a tunnel-like effect that seemed to swallow us deeper with each passing mile. What had begun as an adventure now carried undertones of isolation. Aunt Vera checked her phone repeatedly, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "I'm losing signal," she announced, the worry in her voice no longer concealed. The twins exchanged glances, their earlier playfulness replaced by a subdued tension. I attempted to access my downloaded maps, but the unfamiliar terrain didn't match any of the trails I had studied. The realization that we might be genuinely lost began to take root, a persistent worry that would only intensify as the day progressed. By early afternoon, our situation had deteriorated significantly. The narrow road had become little more than a dirt path, rutted and treacherous. Dense forest surrounded us on both sides, and the canopy above had thickened to the point where the interior of the SUV was cast in perpetual twilight despite the daylight hours. "We need to turn around," Aunt Vera insisted, no longer bothering to mask her anxiety. "This is not the way to Bukidnon Park." Uncle Joey's knuckles had whitened around the steering wheel, and he drove with extreme caution, navigating around fallen branches and deep potholes. "I'm looking for a place wide enough to turn," he replied. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. The atmosphere inside the vehicle had transformed entirely. The twins sat silently, their electronic devices forgotten as they stared out the windows at the ominous surroundings. Judy had drawn her knees up to her chest, making herself as small as possible. I felt an overwhelming responsibility to appear calm for their sake, though my own heart raced with increasing alarm. Try the radio, I suggested, hoping for some connection to the outside world. Some reassurance that we hadn't completely left civilization behind. Uncle Joey flicked through the stations, but only static greeted our ears, a harsh reminder of our isolation. The GPS screen now displayed a confusing maze of unmarked roads, none of which seemed to correspond to our actual location. As the afternoon progressed, the forest appeared to change character. What had initially seemed merely dense and overgrown now took on a more forbidding aspect. The trees stood unnaturally close together, their branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the road like arthritic fingers. Moss hung in thick curtains, and the undergrowth formed an impenetrable wall on either side of our path. "Did you see that?" Chris suddenly asked, pointing toward a gap between the trees. "What?" I asked, following his gaze but seeing nothing but shadows. "I thought I saw someone standing there," he whispered, his voice trembling slightly. "It's just your imagination," I assured him, though I wasn't entirely convinced of my own words. The forest had begun to play tricks on all our senses, and the lengthening shadows created illusions that seemed all too real. The SUV crawled forward at a painfully slow pace, each bump and jolt amplified by our heightened state of alertness. When a branch scraped against the roof with a sound like fingernails on metal, Judy let out a small cry of alarm. The sound lingered in the enclosed space, a stark reminder of our vulnerability. The true test of our nerve came when the path ahead revealed itself to be barely wider than our vehicle, with a sheer drop-off on one side and a wall of solid rock on the other. The ravine beside us plunged into darkness so complete that it was impossible to gauge its depth. A wrong move here would have catastrophic consequences. "Joey, stop," Aunt Vera commanded, her voice tight with fear. "This is too dangerous." Uncle Joey brought the SUV to a halt, the engine idling nervously. "We can't stay here," he argued, though with less conviction than before, "and I don't think we can back up for miles." I leaned forward between the front seats, studying the treacherous passage ahead. "Maybe I should get out and guide you?" I offered, though the thought of stepping outside filled me with inexplicable dread. "No," Aunt Vera replied firmly. "Nobody leaves the vehicle." The decision to proceed was made reluctantly, with Uncle Joey inching the SUV forward at a pace so slow it was barely perceptible. Aunt Vera rolled down her window to better see the edge, calling out continuous directions. Left a bit, the twins had gone completely silent, their faces pale with fear. Judy gripped my hand so tightly that I lost sensation in my fingers, but I didn't pull away. The reassurance of human contact seemed vital in that moment. Each foot of progress felt like a small victory against the increasingly hostile environment. Outside, the light continued to fade as sunset approached, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for us with malevolent intent. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the chilling air. The SUV's tires sent small cascades of pebbles over the edge of the ravine, the sound of their distant impact emphasizing the perilous drop beside us. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, minutes expanding into what felt like hours as we navigated the narrow passage. When we finally reached a slightly wider section where turning might be possible, a collective sigh of relief filled the vehicle. Uncle Joey carefully executed a three-point turn, each maneuver bringing us terrifyingly close to the edge. The SUV's wheels spun briefly on loose gravel, causing a moment of pure terror before finding purchase. With the vehicle finally pointing back the way we had come, I realized I had been holding my breath for so long that my chest ached. The twins looked at each other with expressions of disbelief, as if they couldn't quite comprehend that we had survived the ordeal. "We're going back," Uncle Joey announced unnecessarily, his voice hoarse with tension. "We'll find another route." No one objected. The consensus was clear. Whatever lay ahead on this path was not worth the risk of continuing. Our return journey proceeded with agonizing slowness. The path that had seemed merely threatening on our outward journey now felt actively hostile. Shadows deepened as twilight approached, and the forest around us grew increasingly still, an unnatural quiet that pressed against my eardrums like physical pressure. "Something's wrong," Judy whispered, her eyes wide as she stared out the window. "It's too quiet." She was right. The normal sounds of a forest, birds, insects, the rustling of small animals had completely ceased. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of our engine and the crunch of tires on gravel. The first figure appeared so suddenly that I questioned whether I had actually seen it. A dark silhouette standing motionless among the trees, partially obscured by foliage but unmistakably human in form. I blinked, and it was gone. "Did anyone else see that?" I asked, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. Before anyone could respond, Uncle Joey braked suddenly, bringing the SUV to an abrupt halt. Ahead of us, the road simply ended, terminating in a wall of dense undergrowth. It was as if the path we had traveled only hours before had somehow been erased. "This isn't possible," Uncle Joey muttered, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that I could see the tendons standing out. "We came this way. The road was here." Aunt Vera fumbled in the glove compartment for a flashlight, her movements betraying her escalating fear. "We must have taken a wrong turn," she said, though we all knew we had been following the same narrow path without deviation. The beam of the flashlight cut through the gathering darkness, revealing nothing but impenetrable forest. Uncle Joey reluctantly stepped out of the vehicle to investigate, the dome light briefly illuminating our terrified faces before darkness closed in again. Through the windshield, I watched his figure move cautiously around the front of the SUV, the flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the wall of vegetation. When he suddenly froze, the light fixed on a point just beyond the tree line, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. Uncle Joey backed toward the vehicle with measured steps, never turning his back on whatever he had seen. When he re-entered the SUV, his face was ashen. "There are people out there," he said quietly, locking the doors with deliberate care, standing among the trees, just watching. As if his words had summoned them, dark figures emerged from the forest, arranging themselves in a loose semicircle around the front of our vehicle. They maintained a distance of perhaps 30 feet, never approaching closer but never retreating. The headlights illuminated them dimly, men and women of various ages, dressed in ordinary clothing that somehow seemed out of place in this remote location. Most disturbing was their complete stillness. They did not speak, did not gesture, did not even appear to breathe. They simply watched, their eyes reflecting the headlights with an unnatural gleam. "What do they want?" Kevin whispered, shrinking back in his seat. No one had an answer. The observers made no hostile moves, but their silent vigilance created an atmosphere of menace more effective than any overt threat. "Try to back up," Aunt Vera suggested, her voice trembling. "There must be another way out." Uncle Joey shifted into reverse, and the SUV began to move backward slowly. The watchers remained motionless, their eyes following our retreat with unwavering attention. Not until we had rounded a bend and lost sight of them did anyone speak again. "Who were those people?" Judy asked, her voice small and frightened. "I don't know," Uncle Joey replied honestly, "but we're getting out of here." With renewed determination, Uncle Joey navigated the SUV through the darkening forest. The headlights carved a tunnel through the blackness, revealing only a few feet of road ahead at any time. We had abandoned all hope of reaching our original destination. Our sole objective now was to find our way back to civilization. Every shadow seemed to conceal watching figures, and each rustle in the undergrowth triggered a fresh surge of fear. The twins huddled together in the back seat, occasionally whispering to each other in voices too low for me to hear. Judy maintained her death grip on my hand, her palms slick with nervous perspiration. "The gas is getting low," Uncle Joey announced grimly, tapping the fuel gauge with one finger. "We need to find a main road soon." This new concern added urgency to our already desperate situation. The prospect of being stranded in this hostile forest after dark was too terrible to contemplate. At a fork in the road, Uncle Joey hesitated. Neither path looked promising, both equally narrow, equally enveloped in darkness. After a moment's consideration, he chose the left branch, guiding the SUV onto a slightly wider track that showed faint tire marks. "Someone else has been here," he said, a note of hope entering his voice for the first time in hours. This might lead somewhere. We drove in tense silence, every nerve attuned to our surroundings. The forest seemed to press closer, branches occasionally scraping against the windows with sounds that made my skin crawl. The temperature inside the vehicle had dropped significantly, and I could see goosebumps rising on Judy's arms despite her jacket. When the headlight suddenly illuminated a structure ahead, we collectively leaned forward in anticipation. As we drew closer, the building revealed itself to be an abandoned ranger station, its windows dark and empty. the wooden siding weathered and partially reclaimed by climbing vines. "Should we stop?" Aunt Vera asked uncertainly. Before Uncle Joey could respond, movement caught my eye. More figures emerging from the forest behind the building, arranging themselves in that same eerie, watchful formation we had encountered earlier. "Keep driving," I urged, unable to suppress the tremor in my voice. "They're here too." Uncle Joey accelerated past the ranger station without slowing, and I twisted in my seat to look back. The watchers had moved to the edge of the road, their forms barely distinguishable in the receding taillights, but their presence unmistakable. "They're following us," Kevin whispered, his face pressed against the rear window. "No," Chris corrected, his voice equally hushed. "They're everywhere." This observation, delivered with such simple certainty, struck me as fundamentally true. The watchers weren't pursuing us. They were simply present wherever we went, as if they were aspects of the forest itself rather than individual entities. The fuel gauge had dipped dangerously low, the warning light casting a faint orange glow on the dashboard. Uncle Joey's expression was grim as he pressed on, searching desperately for any sign of a main road or settlement. When the engine began to sputter, we all recognized the sound with sinking hearts. Uncle Joey coaxed the vehicle forward as far as possible before it finally died. Rolling to a stop in the middle of the narrow track, silence descended, absolute and suffocating. Outside, the darkness was complete, unbroken by any artificial light. We sat motionless, reluctant even to breathe too loudly, as if doing so might attract unwanted attention. "What now?" Judy finally asked, her voice barely audible. Uncle Joey checked his phone again, though we all knew there would be no signal.
"We wait until morning," he decided. "It's too dangerous to try walking out in the dark."
The prospect of spending the night in this place sent a wave of dread through me, but I recognized the logic of his decision. Blindly stumbling through the forest would only lead to further disaster. As if responding to our determination to stay put, the first raindrops began to strike the windshield, quickly intensifying into a downpour that drummed on the roof with deafening force. The sudden storm was almost welcome. It provided noise to fill the unnatural silence and obscured the view outside, temporarily shielding us from the watching eyes. I was certain still lingered in the darkness. I must have dozed despite my terror, for I jerked awake to find weak daylight filtering through the rain-streaked windows. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy mist that shrouded the forest in ghostly white. The others were stirring as well, their faces haggard from the night spent in cramped discomfort. Uncle Joey attempted to start the engine again, but it produced only a feeble clicking sound before falling silent. "We need to walk out," he announced, his voice rough with fatigue. "Stay together, stay on the road, and we'll find help." We gathered what supplies we could carry: water bottles, remaining snacks, a first aid kit from the glove compartment. Aunt Vera distributed rain jackets from her luggage, and Uncle Joey armed himself with a tire iron, though none of us mentioned what he might need it for. Stepping outside felt like crossing a threshold into another world. The mist muffled all sound, creating an illusion of isolation so complete that it was possible to believe we were the only living beings for miles. The air was heavy with moisture, and the rich, earthy scent of wet vegetation. "This way," Uncle Joey directed, pointing along the track in the direction we had been traveling. "Single file, stay close." We moved through the mist like ghosts, our footsteps unnaturally loud on the damp ground. I positioned myself between Judy and the twins, constantly checking to ensure they remained close. Aunt Vera led the way, with Uncle Joey bringing up the rear, frequently glancing behind as if expecting pursuit. The forest around us was transformed by the mist, familiar shapes rendered alien and threatening. Trees loomed suddenly out of the whiteness, their branches reaching like grasping hands. Twice I stumbled on hidden roots, my heart racing with momentary panic at each disruption of our careful progress. We had been walking for perhaps an hour when the character of the forest began to change subtly. The trees grew less densely packed, allowing more light to penetrate the mist. The undergrowth thinned, and the path beneath our feet widened almost imperceptibly. "Listen," Aunt Vera said suddenly, raising one hand to halt our procession. We stood motionless, straining our ears. At first I heard nothing but the soft dripping of moisture from the trees. Then it came, the distant but unmistakable sound of a vehicle engine. New energy infused our tired bodies as we quickened our pace, moving toward the promising sound. The mist began to dissipate, revealing glimpses of blue sky above. When the trees parted to display a paved road ahead, I nearly wept with relief. We emerged from the forest onto the shoulder of a two-lane highway, blinking in the sudden brightness. A passing truck slowed at the sight of our bedraggled group, the driver leaning out his window with an expression of concern. "You folks need help," he called, his ordinary question. The most beautiful thing I had heard in 24 hours. Uncle Joey explained our situation: the wrong turn, the abandoned vehicle, the long walk. He carefully omitted any mention of the watchers, a tacit agreement we all understood. Some experiences defied rational explanation and were better left undiscussed. The truck driver, a middle-aged man named Hector with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, offered us a ride to the nearest town. We crowded into his cab with profuse thanks, our earlier ordeal already beginning to feel dreamlike in the normalcy of human contact. As we pulled away, I couldn't resist a final glance back at the forest edge. Through the thinning mist, I thought I glimpsed a solitary figure standing just within the tree line, watching our departure with that same unsettling stillness. When I blinked, it was gone, leaving me to wonder if it had been nothing more than a trick of light and shadow. The small town Hector brought us to possess the extraordinary beauty of the mundane gas stations, fast food restaurants, people going about their ordinary lives. We found a motel where we could clean up and rest while arrangements were made to recover the abandoned SUV. The simple luxury of hot water and clean towels seemed almost miraculous after our ordeal. That evening, gathered in the motel's small diner, we spoke little of what had happened. The experience had created a bond between us that required no verbal reinforcement, a shared understanding that transcended ordinary family ties. "We'll try again tomorrow," Uncle Joey suggested tentatively. "Take the main highway to Bukidnon Park, the way we should have gone in the first place." No one responded immediately. The prospect of returning to any forest, even one clearly marked on official maps and frequented by tourists, held little appeal after what we had endured. "Maybe we should try something different," I finally said. "There's a museum in town that looks interesting." The relief on the twins' faces was answer enough. Our adventure in the wilderness was over, at least for this trip. Some paths once taken leave scars that never fully heal, and some destinations are better left unreached. 6 months have passed since our misadventure in the forest. On the surface, life has returned to normal. We never speak of that day, though I sometimes catch a meaningful glance from Judy or one of the twins when someone mentions camping or nature hikes. Uncle Joey sold the SUV shortly after our return, claiming it had developed mechanical problems that weren't worth fixing. The new vehicle has the latest navigation system, but I've noticed he always carries physical maps as backup now, and he rarely ventures onto unfamiliar roads. Aunt Vera has become more religious, attending services regularly, and wearing a small cross around her neck. When I asked her about this change, she simply said that some experiences make you reconsider what you believe about the world. I understood perfectly what she meant. As for me, I find myself unable to walk in forests anymore. Even well-maintained parks with clearly marked trails trigger an anxiety that constricts my chest and quickens my pulse. The rustling of leaves sounds too much like whispered conversations just beyond the range of comprehension, and the spaces between trees seem designed to conceal watching figures. In my dreams, I return to that place frequently. The road narrows, the light fades, and the watchers emerge from the trees with their terrible patience. Sometimes I am alone in these nightmares, abandoned in the deepening darkness while unseen observers wait for me to make a fatal mistake. I've researched the area we traveled through, seeking some rational explanation for what we experienced. Local history mentions an abandoned settlement deep in those woods, a community that disappeared without explanation in the 1950s. The few photographs available show ordinary people standing before simple homes, their expressions solemn as they gaze into the camera. Sometimes I think I recognize those faces. What troubles me most is not the fear we felt that day, though it was more intense than anything I had previously experienced. Rather, it is the sense that we encountered something fundamentally wrong, a tear in the fabric of reality that revealed glimpses of something that should remain hidden. God protect me from ever learning the truth about those watchers in the forest. Some mysteries are not meant to be solved, some knowledge not meant to be possessed. The human mind is not designed to comprehend certain aspects of existence, and sanity depends on our continued ignorance. Yet I cannot escape the feeling that our encounter was not random. The Watchers selected us for reasons I cannot fathom, allowed us to leave when they could have prevented our escape. This sense of being chosen, of being marked in some way, follows me through my days like a shadow that cannot be outrun. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is that the Watchers may not have been confined to that remote forest. Now that I have seen them once, I sometimes think I glimpse similar figures in ordinary settings: a motionless observer at the edge of a crowded mall parking lot, a too-still presence on a subway platform, a solitary figure at the periphery of a public park who never seems to move or interact with others. Always watching, always waiting. For what purpose, I dare not imagine. I have told no one these thoughts. They would suggest therapy, medication, rational explanations for irrational fears. But I know what I experienced, what we all experienced in those woods. Some truths cannot be shared without sounding like madness, yet remain truths nonetheless. So I continue with my life, attending classes, planning for college, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. But a part of me remains in that forest, forever walking that narrow path between safety and oblivion, forever aware of unseen eyes tracking my progress through the gathering darkness. And sometimes, in the moment between wakefulness and sleep, I hear a whisper that might be the wind through trees, or might be something else entirely. We are still watching. We will always be watching. The road goes on, but I am forever changed by where it led us that day. Some journeys mark you permanently. Some destinations remain with you long after you have physically departed. The forest and its watchers have become part of me now, a shadow that lengthens as the day wanes, a presence that can never be entirely banished. I only pray they remain content with watching from a distance, because in my darkest moments I fear they might someday decide to do more than watch. The smell of microwave popcorn filled Jade's apartment as I settled onto her plush couch, wrapped in the throw blanket I'd claimed as my own over years of friendship. It was October 2022, and at 28, I found these quiet nights increasingly precious as adult responsibilities consumed more of our lives. Her apartment was cozy despite its disorganization. String lights illuminated stacks of books and half-finished craft projects, while photos of our college adventures covered nearly every wall space. "I've missed this," I said, watching her arrange snacks on the coffee table. "Work has been absolute torture lately." Jade nodded as she poured wine into mismatched glasses. "Tell me about it. The promotion sounds great until you're drowning in spreadsheets at midnight." We hadn't seen each other in nearly 2 months, our longest gap since becoming friends in freshman year. The plan was simple: comfort food, nostalgic movies, and absolutely no discussion of our professional lives. Her apartment perfectly reflected her personality, chaotic but inviting. Empty coffee mugs collected on bookshelves beside carefully tended plants, and her collection of vintage movie posters gave the space a unique charm. "I cleaned for 3 hours before you got here," she confessed, noticing my glance at the scattered magazines. "This is actually the presentable version." I laughed. "You should see my place. I'm pretty sure something's evolving in my refrigerator at this point." As Jade scrolled through streaming options, I sank deeper into the couch. The familiar comfort of our friendship temporarily masked the exhaustion that had been my constant companion for weeks. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows, creating the perfect backdrop for our evening. "So dinner," Jade announced, putting down the remote. "I was thinking pizza. That place on Westmore that we used to love just started delivering to this neighborhood." "Perfect," I agreed, already imagining the garlic knots that had sustained us through countless study sessions. "My treat this time." Jade hesitated slightly, her fingers hovering over her phone. "Actually, I've got this guy who might be bringing it over." She caught my expression and quickly added, "Not like that. He's just, well, you'll see. His name is Gordon. He helps me out sometimes." I raised an eyebrow. "Helps you out? That sounds suspiciously like you've acquired a personal assistant." "It's not like that," she insisted, though her tone suggested otherwise. "He's just really helpful." Little did I understand the true meaning behind her words, or how significantly this helpful stranger would alter the course of our lives. When the doorbell rang 40 minutes later, Jade jumped up with unexpected nervousness. "That'll be Gordon with the food," she said, smoothing her sweatpants as if suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. "Just the delivery guy," I mumbled, slightly annoyed at the interruption to our evening. I had assumed we'd be alone. The man who entered carried more than just pizza boxes. An immediate atmosphere of awkwardness followed him into the room. Tall, thin, with darting eyes that never quite settled on anything. He appeared to be in his early 30s, dressed in a neatly pressed button-down shirt that seemed oddly formal for delivering food. "Hi, Gordon," Jade greeted him with excessive warmth. "Thanks so much for doing this." "No problem at all," he replied, his voice softer than his frame would suggest. He placed the boxes on the counter with careful precision. "I got extra napkins like you asked, and those breadsticks from the place across town that you mentioned last week." I noticed he'd brought items from 2 different restaurants, a detail that struck me as strange for ordinary delivery. "Gordon, this is my friend," Jade introduced us. "We've known each other since college." His eyes finally connected with mine, and I felt a strange sensation, like being examined rather than seen. "Nice to meet you," he said, extending a hand that was unexpectedly cold. "Likewise," I responded automatically, discomfort building as he held the handshake several seconds too long. "Gordon has been amazingly helpful since I moved to this neighborhood," Jade explained, her tone suggesting she wanted me to approve of him. "He knows everyone and everything around here." Gordon's posture changed subtly at the praise, standing straighter as a hint of smile formed. "Just trying to be neighborly." The conversation stalled into uncomfortable silence before Gordon suddenly asked, "Do you live nearby too?" Before I could formulate a vague answer, Jade supplied, "She's over on Riverview, in those new apartments." I shot her a look of betrayal as Gordon nodded, mentally filing away this information. "That's a nice area, great running trails behind those buildings." The implication that he knew my neighborhood in detail made me uneasy. "Maybe we could exchange numbers," he suggested, phone already in hand, "in case you ever need anything delivered. Or help with, well, anything at all." With Jade watching expectantly, I reluctantly recited my number, which Gordon saved with meticulous attention. "Well, I should let you enjoy your evening," he finally said, though he made no immediate move toward the door. "Thanks again, Gordon. Drive safe," Jade prompted, finally giving him the cue to leave. When the door closed behind him, I turned to Jade with widened eyes. "What was that about?" She busied herself with the pizza boxes. "He's just really helpful. Picks up groceries, does errands. It started when I needed help moving a bookshelf, and now he's your unpaid servant who knows where I live," I finished. "He's harmless," she insisted. "Just lonely, I think. No social skills, but desperately wants friends." As we settled back with our food, I couldn't shake the sensation of Gordon's cold handshake, or the way his eyes had cataloged every detail of my appearance. Despite Jade's assurances, something about Gordon felt deeply wrong, a feeling I would later wish I had trusted more fully. Within hours of meeting Gordon, my phone buzzed with a new group message. "Created new chat, weekend friends," read the notification, followed by Gordon's first message. A meme about pizza that wasn't particularly funny. "He added you to our chat," Jade texted privately. "Sorry, he does this." Over the next weeks, Gordon maintained a careful digital presence, sending just enough messages to remain connected without crossing into obvious harassment. His strategy seemed calculated. A funny video on Tuesday, a local news story on Thursday, an offer of assistance every Saturday morning, like clockwork. "Need any help this weekend?" became his refrain, accompanied by lists of errands he could run or tasks he could complete. I consistently declined with brief politeness. "All good this weekend, but thanks." His responses were always immediate and excessive. "No problem at all. Just let me know if anything changes. Happy to help anytime. Enjoy your weekend." The exclamation points felt like tiny shouts of desperation. Through Jade, I learned more about Gordon's involvement in her life. He had somehow integrated himself into her routine, delivering groceries she never requested, appearing with coffee when she casually mentioned being tired, offering rides when her car was in the shop. "Doesn't it concern you?" I asked during one of our phone calls. "How much he knows about your schedule?" "Sometimes," she admitted, "but it's also really convenient, and he never asks for anything in return." "That's what worries me," I replied. "People usually want something." When Gordon began referencing details I'd mentioned in conversations with Jade, my dislike of mushrooms, my work schedule, a planned trip to visit my parents, I realized he was extracting information indirectly. His knowledge accumulated in small, seemingly innocuous pieces. My favorite coffee shop, my running route, my car's make and model, my apartment building's layout, each detail insignificant alone but disturbing in aggregate. I began carefully filtering information shared with Jade, knowing it might reach Gordon. This caution proved justified when he sent a get well soon message after I'd called in sick to work, information I'd only shared with my boss and Jade. The persistent offers of help continued until, in a moment of poor judgment I would come to deeply regret, I finally accepted. The washing machine in my apartment building had been broken for 2 weeks when I spotted a reasonably priced replacement on an online marketplace. The problem? I had no way to transport it, and professional installation was beyond my budget. During a moment of frustration, I mentioned this in the group chat. Gordon's response was instantaneous. "I can help. I have a truck and know how to install washing machines. When would work for you?" After a day of deliberation and Jade's assurance that Gordon had helped her with similar tasks, I reluctantly agreed. "That would be really helpful, actually. Are you sure it's not too much trouble?" "No trouble at all. Happy to help," came his eager reply. That Saturday, Gordon arrived in a meticulously clean pickup truck, wearing work gloves and carrying a toolbox that appeared to contain every possible tool required. The efficiency with which he loaded the washing machine, transported it, and installed it in my apartment was admittedly impressive. What unsettled me was his attention to my living space. The way his eyes lingered on family photos, how he noted my book collection, the casual opening of cabinets under the premise of looking for connections. "You have a nice place," he commented, his gaze sweeping across my apartment in what felt like memorization. "Very secure building, too. Good locks." When the installation was complete, I attempted to pay him for his time and effort. "Please, let me give you something for all this work." Gordon shook his head firmly. "I don't want your money." "Then at least let me buy you lunch or something," I insisted, uncomfortable with the imbalance of obligation. His expression shifted subtly. "Actually, there is something." He maintained casual eye contact that felt anything but casual. "There's this trail I know, not far from here. Great views. Maybe we could hike it sometime? This weekend, perhaps?" The request hung in the air, seemingly innocent yet loaded with implication. My instinct screamed to decline, but the weight of social obligation, he had just spent 3 hours helping me, made outright rejection difficult. "I suppose that would work," I heard myself agreeing. "Just a short hike, though. I have plans later in the day." Gordon's face transformed with genuine pleasure. "Great. I'll pick you up Sunday at 9. After he left, I immediately called Jade. "I just agreed to go hiking with Gordon." "Oh," she paused. "That's new. He's never asked me to do anything social." "Should I be worried?" I asked directly. "No," she answered, though her hesitation was noticeable. "He's odd but harmless. Just maybe keep your location shared with me." That night, I researched the trail Gordon had mentioned. Oak Ridge Trail, a popular local hiking spot with well-traveled paths and regular ranger patrols. This knowledge provided some comfort, but anxiety still crept through my dreams, manifesting as visions of forests and watching eyes. Sunday morning arrived with perfect autumn clarity, crisp air, golden sunlight, and a sky so intensely blue it seemed artificially enhanced. Under different circumstances, it would have been an ideal day for hiking. Gordon arrived precisely at 9, his truck freshly washed, wearing hiking boots that appeared brand new. He had brought water bottles, trail mix, and a first aid kit, all presented with a shopkeeper's pride. "Safety first," he said, indicating the kit. "Never know what might happen on a trail." The drive to Oak Ridge was filled with Gordon's monologue about local history, plant identification, and hiking safety, information delivered with the rehearsed quality of a tour guide. I contributed occasional acknowledgments while sharing my location with both Jade and my sister. The trailhead parking lot contained several other vehicles, a reassuring sign of other hikers. Gordon seemed slightly disappointed by this. "It's busier than usual," he remarked. "We might want to take one of the less traveled paths to get the full experience." "I prefer staying on the main trail," I countered firmly, "especially since I'm not familiar with this area." He acquiesced with a tight smile, and we began our hike on the well-marked main path. For the first mile, everything progressed normally. Gordon maintained a respectful distance, pointed out interesting plants, and shared genuinely engaging facts about local wildlife. The tension in my shoulders began to ease slightly as we passed other hiking groups. Then we reached a fork in the trail. "The main path continues that way," Gordon indicated the wider, clearly maintained route. "But there's something really special down this side trail, something not many people get to see." The smaller path veered sharply downhill, disappearing into denser forest. No other hikers were visible in that direction. "What's down there?" I asked. remaining firmly in place. "It's hard to explain," Gordon replied, his voice taking on an unusual intensity. "It's something I discovered a few weeks ago. Something remarkable. I've been waiting for the right person to share it with." Alarm bells screamed in my mind as Gordon stepped closer, his expression shifting into something I hadn't seen before, an almost childlike excitement tinged with something darker. "It's not far," he continued, already moving toward the side path. "Just 5 minutes. You'll never forget it, I promise." Making a split-second decision I would later recognize as profoundly unwise, I followed, partially from curiosity, partially from the social pressure of not wanting to seem unreasonable, and partially from the false security of knowing others were nearby on the main trail. The side path descended steeply, forcing us to navigate exposed roots and slippery leaves. The sunlight diminished as the tree canopy thickened overhead, temperature dropping noticeably. Gordon moved with unexpected agility, frequently looking back to ensure I was following. After several minutes, longer than the promised 5, Gordon stopped abruptly. "We're almost there," he whispered, though there was no apparent reason for lowered voices. "Just through these trees." He pushed aside a branch, revealing a small clearing surrounded by dense undergrowth. My heart rate accelerated as I stepped forward, unsure what I expected to find. What awaited would permanently alter the trajectory of my life. The clearing was unremarkable at first glance, a depression in the forest floor scattered with fallen leaves and broken branches. Then the smell registered, a heavy, sickly sweet odor that caught in my throat and triggered an instinctive recoil. Gordon stood motionless, watching me intently. "Do you see it?" I didn't want to look where he was indicating, but my eyes followed his gesture to a disturbed area of ground partially concealed by gathered branches and leaves. Through the deliberate camouflage, I could distinguish the unmistakable shape of a human form. The body lay face up, partially buried but clearly visible. A man in his 40s, dressed in hiking clothes now discolored and degraded. Natural decomposition had begun its inexorable process, the face distorted but still recognizably human. Various insects moved purposefully across the exposed skin. My body responded before my mind could process, stepping backward, breathing quickening, fingernails digging into my palms. "Isn't it fascinating?" Gordon's voice had transformed, carrying a reverent quality that chilled me more than the sight itself. "I found him 3 weeks ago. No one else knows he's here." Horror compounded as the implications clarified. Gordon had discovered a dead body in the woods and chosen to keep it secret, to preserve it as a macabre exhibit to share with select viewers. "We need to call the police," I managed, voice barely cooperating. Gordon continued as if I hadn't spoken. "At first the smell was overwhelming, but it's better now. I've been documenting the changes. Nature's recycling process is remarkably efficient." The casualness of his tone, discussing human decomposition as one might describe a science experiment, triggered a surge of adrenaline. My survival instincts finally overcame social conditioning. "I think I'm going to be sick," I gasped, turning away. "I need to get back to the main trail." Gordon stepped closer, his expression showing not concern, but disappointment. "We just got here. Don't you want to look closer? The way the insects have specialized is truly remarkable." "No," I said firmly, already moving backward. "I need air. We need to report this immediately." As I retreated up the path, Gordon followed reluctantly. "Most people don't understand," he called after me. "They're disconnected from the reality of death. This is natural, beautiful even." I increased my pace, desperate to reach other hikers. The isolation of the side trail now felt suffocating, the distance back to safety impossibly long. Gordon kept pace easily, continuing his disturbing commentary. When we finally emerged onto the main trail, I spotted an older couple approaching. With forced casualness that took tremendous effort, I called out to them. "Excuse me, could you point us toward the trailhead? I think we took a wrong turn." The man consulted a trail map. "You're heading the right way, but it's about 2 miles back." "Would you mind if we walked with you?" I asked, ignoring Gordon's frown. "I'm feeling a bit lightheaded." The couple agreed readily, and I positioned myself between them and Gordon, ensuring I wouldn't be left alone with him again. The mile-long walk back felt interminable, my mind racing between processing what I'd seen and planning my next actions. As we approached the parking area, I pulled out my phone and pretended to receive a call. "Hi, Jade," I said to the silent phone. "Yes, I'm still with Gordon. We're just finishing our hike." I'll have him drop me at your place in about 20 minutes, okay? Gordon watched this performance with narrowed eyes but said nothing. Inside Gordon's truck, silence hung heavily as we pulled away from the trailhead. My heart hammered against my ribs as I gripped my phone tightly, ready to call emergency services at the first sign of danger. "You didn't enjoy our discovery," Gordon finally said, his tone suggesting genuine bewilderment. "Gordon, that was a dead person," I stated firmly. "Someone who should be reported to authorities and returned to their family." He shrugged slightly. "Death is part of life. Most people hide from it. But I find that dishonest." "Did you—" I hesitated, uncertain how to phrase my suspicion. "How did you first find the body?" "Hiking," he answered simply. "Same trail, about 3 weeks ago. I was exploring off-path and there he was." I studied his profile, searching for tells of deception. "And you didn't report it because—" "Reports mean paperwork, questions, interruptions to the natural process." His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. "People fear what they don't understand." While his explanation left critical questions unanswered, his attention remained fortunately focused on driving. I texted Jade under the guise of checking my notifications. "Emergency. Gordon showed me a dead body in the woods, not joking. Coming to your place. Call police after we arrive." Her response was immediate. "What? Are you safe? Should I call now?" "Wait until I'm there. Don't want him to run. Act normal when we arrive." The 20-minute drive stretched into eternity. I maintained superficial conversation while mentally cataloging every detail I could remember about the body and location to report to police. When we finally reached Jade's apartment, she was waiting outside, her casual pose betrayed by the tension visible in her shoulders. "Thanks for the ride," I told Gordon, exiting quickly. "And the hike." "We should do it again," he suggested, seeming genuinely oblivious to the horror of the situation. "There's more to see on other trails." "Sure," I lied. "Text me." Jade and I watched him drive away before rushing inside. The moment her door closed, I collapsed against it, trembling uncontrollably. "Tell me everything," she demanded. Between gasping breaths, I recounted the discovery. Jade called the police immediately, her voice steady despite her pallor. Within 30 minutes, 2 detectives sat in Jade's living room as I detailed my experience. They listened with professional detachment, occasionally interjecting with clarifying questions. "And you're certain the individual was deceased?" one asked. "Not injured?" "Absolutely certain," I confirmed. "Decomposition was advanced." They asked about Gordon, his full name, address, how we knew him, his behavior before and after showing me the body. I described his disturbing fascination and lack of appropriate emotional response. "We'll need you to guide officers to the location," the detective explained. "Can you do that tomorrow morning?" I nodded, despite the revulsion at the thought of returning. After they left, Jade and I sat in stunned silence before she finally spoke. "I never thought... He was strange. But this... We need to cut him out completely," I insisted. "Block his number, his social media, everything." "What if he retaliates?" she whispered. "He knows where we both live." The realization that Gordon now presented an active threat rather than merely an unsettling presence settled over us like a shroud. "We need a plan," I said. "A careful exit strategy." The following weeks unfolded in a blur of police statements, nightmares, and constant vigilance. I led officers to the body, which was recovered and later identified as a 45-year-old hiker who had been reported missing a month earlier. Cause of death was determined to be a cardiac event, a natural death that Gordon had transformed into something macabre through his actions. Gordon himself remained disturbingly present in our periphery. His messages continued as if nothing had happened, though we responded with increasing brevity. Police questioned him extensively about his failure to report finding the body, but without evidence of foul play in the hiker's death, they could only charge him with relatively minor offenses related to interfering with a death scene. Our exit strategy from Gordon's life proceeded with excruciating slowness. We feared that an abrupt disconnection might trigger escalation, so instead we implemented a deliberate fade, delayed responses, claims of busyness, gradual unavailability. Gordon seemed to sense the withdrawal. His messages increased in frequency even as our responses decreased. He appeared unexpectedly outside Jade's workplace one afternoon just to say hello, and left packages of unrequested groceries at our doors. The breakthrough came unexpectedly when Jade began dating someone. When she mentioned her new relationship in our group chat, Gordon's messages suddenly ceased entirely. The silence was both relieving and unnerving. 3 months after the hiking incident, police arrested a man in connection with another death, a homicide that had occurred in the same forest region. Through social media investigation, they discovered this man had connections to Gordon. They followed each other on several platforms and had exchanged messages. While Gordon was never charged with direct involvement in any homicide, the investigation revealed disturbing patterns in his behavior. Documented fascination with death scenes, extensive photography of roadkill and dead animals, and journal entries detailing his observations of decomposition processes. Psychological evaluation concluded he suffered from a complex combination of conditions that manifested in his inappropriate responses to death and human remains, along with his patterns of intrusive behavior and social misconduct. Today, 5 years later, I still avoid hiking trails. The rustle of leaves in wooded areas triggers immediate anxiety. Jade has moved to another state, partly motivated by putting distance between herself and the memories of Gordon. The last we heard, Gordon had been institutionalized after an incident involving cemetery desecration. While his direct connection to any murder remains unproven, his relationship with death continues to exist outside normal human boundaries. What stays with me most isn't the disturbing image of the body in the woods, though that appears often enough in dreams. Rather, it's the memory of Gordon's expression as he showed me his discovery, the genuine incomprehension that I didn't share his fascination, the complete disconnect from normal human emotion. In the years since, I've come to understand that the most terrifying monsters aren't supernatural creatures lurking in shadows. They're the people walking among us whose internal landscape is so fundamentally different from our own that connection becomes impossible. People who look human but operate by unfathomable rules. I keep my doors doubly locked now. I verify the identity of delivery people through peepholes. I no longer give out my phone number casually, and I've become selective about which social media platforms I use. Most importantly, I've learned to trust that flutter of unease when something feels wrong about a person or situation. That sensation exists for a reason, an evolutionary warning system honed over millennia of human experience. When someone shows you who they are, especially in small, unsettling ways, believe them the first time. Your survival may depend on it. My name is John Erskine, and this happened to me back in 2012 in the Allegheny National Forest in Pennsylvania. I'd been living in a small cabin a few miles off the old service road, trying to make a quiet life without power lines or neighbors. I liked it that way. I had a small hand-built shelter with a wood stove and a cot, a rain barrel, and enough canned goods to get by for months if I had to. The forest stretched in all directions, thick with oak and beech trees, their leaves filtering the sunlight so it always felt like late afternoon under the canopy. Back then, the sound of nothing, that gentle hush of wind and distant bird calls, soothed my nerves. I felt at home. People often ask why I chose to live that way. The truth is complicated. 3 years before, I'd walked away from a career in architectural engineering after a building collapse killed 2 workers. The investigation cleared me of wrongdoing, but I couldn't shake the guilt. The sound of their names being read at the memorial service still echoed in my head on quiet nights. So I retreated, inch by inch, from civilization. First to a small apartment in Pittsburgh, then to a rental cottage in rural Butler County, and finally to this cabin I purchased for cash from an old hunter who could no longer make the trek into the woods. The transaction was simple: $10,000, a handshake, and a crude hand-drawn map marking the property lines. The cabin itself was primitive but sturdy. 18 by 24 feet, with rough-hewn logs chinked with a mixture of clay and moss. The roof was simple cedar shakes I'd repaired myself during that first spring. Inside, I had the basics: the wood stove that served for both heating and cooking, a small table with 2 chairs, though I never had visitors, shelves lined with canned goods and supplies, and my cot with wool blankets that smelled of cedar and smoke. I rarely saw anyone else. On a good week, I might spot a single vehicle rumbling far off on a dirt road, or glimpse a pair of hikers passing by a few ridges over. That year had been especially quiet. The only real human contact came when I hiked out twice a month for supplies at a gas station off Route 66, where the clerk sometimes called me Mountain Man and asked if I was crazy to live that way. The clerk, an older man named Roy with tobacco-stained fingers and cracked leather skin, once told me, "Wood's got eyes, you know, always watching. Man ain't meant to be alone out there." I laughed it off, but sometimes in the dead of night, when the wind died down completely and the forest fell unnaturally silent, I wondered if he was right. My days followed a simple rhythm. I woke with the sun, cooked a small breakfast of oatmeal or whatever I had on hand, and spent the morning on maintenance tasks. Afternoons were for gathering firewood, hunting, checking my crude traps for rabbits, or tending to the small garden I'd started behind the cabin where the sun broke through the canopy for a few precious hours. Evenings were for reading dog-eared paperbacks by oil lamplight, writing in my journal, or just sitting outside watching the stars emerge between the treetops. One evening, early October, I remember the sun dipping low and the air cooling fast. The leaves were starting to turn, painting the forest in fierce oranges and deep reds. I'd been cutting deadwood for the stove and stacking it behind the cabin. I kept my tools neat: an old axe with a hickory handle smoothed by years of use, a worn handsaw that needed sharpening, and a hatchet for kindling. After a few hours, my arms ached nicely, and I felt good about my work. I sat out front on a stump I'd fashioned into a seat, chewing on some jerky, watching a few crows hop around the clearing. The forest had felt different that day. Quieter than usual. No distant woodpeckers, fewer squirrels chattering in the branches. Even the wind seemed reluctant to stir the leaves. I didn't think much of it then. Weather changes, animals migrating, nothing unusual for autumn. As the light faded, I noticed movement near the creek that trickled about 100 yards downhill from my cabin. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. At first, I assumed it was a deer carcass. Hunters sometimes failed to track their kill properly, and it wouldn't be the first time I'd found the remains of someone else's hunt. But I didn't see antlers, didn't see the shape move. Something felt wrong. The air seemed to thicken around me as I stared at that dark shape near the creek bed. I set down my jerky and stood, stretching my stiff back. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was something that needed investigating before dark. Either way, I needed to know. I grabbed my leather gloves and a walking stick I'd carved from ash wood, more out of habit than any sense of danger. The sun had nearly disappeared behind the western ridge, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the leaf-strewn ground. Should check it out, I muttered to myself, breaking the silence that had settled around me. My voice sounded strange in my ears, too loud and yet somehow muffled by the dense forest air. I started down the gentle slope toward the creek, not knowing that in the next few hours, everything about my quiet life would change forever. The forest floor crunched beneath my boots as I made my way downhill. Fallen leaves in amber and russet formed a crackling carpet that made stealth impossible. I followed a faint game trail worn by deer coming to drink at the creek, winding between old-growth trees with trunks wider than my outstretched arms. As I got closer, I could make out more details of the strange object. It wasn't a deer, after all. It was something bright, unnaturally bright for the forest, a splash of vivid color against the earthy palette of autumn. A backpack, bright red with black straps, lying in the brush at an odd angle, as if it had been thrown or dropped in haste. I paused, scanning the area. Hikers weren't uncommon in the national forest, but they rarely ventured this far from the marked trails, and they certainly didn't abandon expensive gear without good reason. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the dense trees. No response came except for the startled flutter of wings as a bird took flight somewhere above me. I approached cautiously, looking for signs of whoever had left the pack behind. The ground around it showed scuff marks and broken twigs, signs of a struggle, or someone moving erratically. I crouched beside the backpack, noting how the main compartment had been torn open, its contents scattered. A few protein bars with the wrappers still intact, a high-end flashlight that still worked when I pressed the button, a single hiking boot with the laces undone, and a trail map from some local outfitter. I picked up the map, unfolding it with care. A route had been marked in red pen, starting from the Millstone Creek trailhead about 5 miles east and venturing deep into the forest, right through the area where my cabin stood. Someone had written, "Day 2 inches" near my section of the woods. An uneasy feeling settled in my stomach, cold and heavy. Something was wrong here. People don't just abandon their gear in the wilderness without reason. I folded the map and stood, intending to gather the scattered items. That's when I noticed the drag marks in the soft earth near the creek bank. a long, irregular furrow leading away from the backpack and deeper into the undergrowth. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to turn around, walk back to my cabin, and pretend I'd seen nothing. The forest had always been my sanctuary, not a place of dread. But curiosity pushed me forward, one reluctant step after another, following those drag marks through a thicket of mountain laurel. The brush opened to a small clearing, and that's where I found him. A man lying face down, his jacket pushed up around his shoulders, exposing a thin strip of pale skin above his jeans. The back of his head was matted with something dark and sticky that caught the fading light with a sickening gleam. His left arm bent under him at an impossible angle, and he didn't move at all. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The man looked to be around 30, with short brown hair and an Apache-style beard. He wore expensive hiking gear, the kind serious outdoorsmen invest in, not casual weekend warriors. "Hey," I called weakly, though I already knew he wouldn't answer. The stillness around him had the unmistakable quality of death. No rise and fall of breathing, no subtle shifts of a body at rest. I approached slowly, as if he might suddenly sit up. The smell hit me when I got closer. Metallic and organic, the unmistakable scent of fresh blood mixed with something else, something worse. I knelt beside him, touching his neck with 2 fingers, searching for a pulse I knew I wouldn't find. His skin felt cool but not cold, meaning he hadn't been dead long. Hours, not days. The back of his skull had been crushed by something heavy, caved in like an eggshell. Dried blood formed a dark halo in the dirt beneath his head. This wasn't an accident. No fall could cause damage this severe. This was murder. I rocked back on my heels, my mind racing. I needed to report this. The nearest ranger station was 15 miles away, the closest phone even further. By the time I got help and returned, it would be well past midnight. A twig snapped somewhere uphill. The sound cut through my thoughts like a knife. I turned sharply, scanning the forest behind me. The day had faded to dusk, shadows deepening between the trees. Then I saw them. 2 figures picking their way through the brush about 40 yards away. One wore a stained yellow jacket, loose and torn at the elbows, with pale, bony arms protruding. He moved with an unsettling grace, like a predator accustomed to stalking prey. At his side hung a long hunting knife with a black handle, the blade catching what little light remained. His face looked narrow and sharp, with a crooked nose and a beard trimmed into a rough goatee. The other man was heavier set, with broad shoulders straining against a sweat-soaked gray t-shirt despite the cool evening air. He cradled something in his right hand, a metal pipe or tool that gleamed dully. His face was partially obscured by a dark baseball cap pulled low, but I could see a thick jaw covered in stubble. They weren't hikers, they weren't forest rangers. They were moving with purpose, scanning the ground, following a trail, my trail. And based on the dead man at my feet, I had a terrible suspicion about who they were and what they'd done. Our eyes met across the distance. For a moment, nobody moved. The thin man narrowed his eyes and slowly shook his head, a subtle warning that sent ice through my veins. Run. That single word pulsed through my mind, overriding all other thoughts. I turned and fled uphill, abandoning any pretense of careful movement. Branches whipped my face as I crashed through the undergrowth, my boots slipping on damp leaves. Behind me, I heard them give chase, their movements just as frantic and much less cautious. "Get him!" a rough voice shouted, followed by the sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls. I knew these woods better than they did. That was my only advantage. I veered off the path I'd taken down, cutting across a steeper section where fallen trees created natural barriers. My lungs burned as I pushed uphill, propelled by raw fear. My cabin was about 200 yards away, just over the next rise. I could make it if I kept moving, if I didn't fall. The growing darkness worked both for and against me. Harder for them to spot me, but easier for me to miss my footing. A rock turned under my boot and I stumbled, barely catching myself on a tree trunk. The rough bark scraped my palms as I pushed off again, hearing my pursuers gaining ground. The heavier man was cursing steadily, his breathing labored but determined. I crested the small ridge and saw my cabin ahead, a dark silhouette against the deepening blue of the evening sky. Never had that simple structure looked so much like salvation. I sprinted across the clearing, making for the tool shed where I'd left my axe after splitting wood. The shed door squeaked as I yanked it open, fumbling in the darkness for the familiar wooden handle. My fingers closed around it just as the 2 men emerged from the trees at the edge of my property. I backed away from the shed, axe gripped tightly in both hands, and moved behind the cabin where shadows would hide me. My heart hammered so hard I was certain they could hear it. I pressed my back against the rough logs and tried to control my breathing, listening for their approach. For a long minute, silence stretched across the clearing. Had they lost track of me? Had they given up? I dared to hope, but then I heard the crunch of boots on dry leaves coming steadily closer. "I know you're here," the thin man called, his voice deceptively calm. "We just want to talk." The absurdity of his words might have made me laugh if I wasn't terrified. They hadn't chased me through the forest to talk. They'd killed one man already. I was a witness. The math wasn't complicated. I gripped the axe tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I had to move. Staying put would only corner me. I edged along the cabin wall, trying to keep my footsteps silent, working my way toward the front where I might have a chance to make a break for deeper woods. A twig snapped under my boot, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. "There!" the heavier man shouted, and heavy footsteps pounded toward my position. I abandoned stealth and ran, but I'd waited too long. The thin man appeared around the corner of the cabin, his knife already raised. Our eyes met, and I saw nothing human there, just cold calculation and the promise of violence. He lunged. I swung the axe in a wild arc. The night had just begun. The axe whistled through the air, missing the thin man by inches as he danced backward with surprising agility. His eyes widened slightly. Perhaps he hadn't expected me to fight back, before narrowing with renewed determination. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice unnervingly gentle, like someone speaking to a frightened animal. I didn't respond. Words seemed pointless now. I adjusted my grip on the axe and kept my eyes on his knife, a serious hunting blade, at least 8 inches long with a serrated section near the handle. The kind designed for gutting and skinning. We circled each other in the growing darkness, the space between the cabin and the tree line becoming our arena. I was acutely aware of every sound, his soft footfalls, my own ragged breathing, and the absence of the heavier man's movements. Where was he? The answer came with brutal clarity as a shadow detached itself from the side of the cabin. The heavier man had circled around while his partner kept me distracted. He swung the metal pipe in a vicious arc toward my head. I jerked backward, but not fast enough. The pipe glanced off my left shoulder, sending a bolt of white-hot pain down my arm. I staggered, nearly dropping the axe, my vision blurring momentarily. The thin man seized the opportunity, darting forward with his knife. I twisted away, feeling the blade slice through my jacket sleeve and into the flesh of my forearm. Warm blood immediately soaked the fabric, but adrenaline dulled the pain to a distant throb. I swung the axe one-handed, forcing them both to retreat briefly. My injured arm hung awkwardly at my side, blood dripping from my fingertips onto the fallen leaves below. "You've got spirit," the thin man said, almost admiringly. "Most would have collapsed by now." "What do you want?" I finally asked, my voice hoarse. "I don't have anything worth taking." The heavier man chuckled, a sound like stones grinding together. "It ain't about taking. It's about leaving no trace." They began to separate, moving to flank me on either side. I backed up until I felt the cabin wall behind me, eliminating one avenue of attack but trapping myself in the process. My options were dwindling rapidly. The cabin door was about 15 feet to my right. If I could reach it, get inside, perhaps I could barricade myself and find another weapon. The shotgun stored in the loft suddenly seemed like my only hope. I feinted left, then pivoted right and sprinted for the door. The thin man anticipated my move and lunged to intercept me, but I brought the axe down in a desperate swing that forced him to dive aside. The heavier man was slower to react, giving me the seconds I needed to reach the door. I practically threw myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me and fumbling with the simple wooden latch. It wouldn't hold them for long. The door was sturdy enough for keeping out curious animals, not determined killers, but it might buy me precious time. Inside, the cabin was dark and still. I moved by memory and touch, making my way to the small table and dragging it across the plank floor to wedge against the door. My wounded arm protested every movement, hot streams of blood making my grip slippery. "We know you saw us," the thin man called from outside, his voice muffled by the logs between us. "We know you saw him too. Can't let you go telling tales." I ignored his words, focused entirely on survival. I grabbed a clean dish towel from beside my wash basin and hastily wrapped it around my forearm, cinching it tight with my teeth and good hand. The white fabric immediately bloomed red, but the pressure slowed the bleeding. Next, I needed a better weapon. The kitchen knife was pathetically inadequate, barely 6 inches long with a cheap, dull blade I used for opening cans and cutting vegetables. But it was better than nothing. I snatched it from its place on the shelf, then looked around the dark cabin for anything else that might serve. The shotgun. My grandfather's old Remington pump action, stored in the loft for years, practically forgotten. Did I even have shells for it? I couldn't remember the last time I'd fired it or checked its condition. Outside, I heard the men conferring in low voices. Then footsteps circling the cabin, testing windows, looking for weaknesses. I used the moment to climb the rickety ladder to the loft, moving as quietly as possible on the creaking wood. The loft was cramped and dusty, hardly more than a storage space under the peaked roof. I felt around in the darkness, hands skimming over cardboard boxes and cloth bundles. Finally, my fingers touched cold metal, the shotgun wrapped in an old oilcloth. I pulled it free, heart pounding with desperate hope. The weapon felt heavier than I remembered, the blued steel catching what little moonlight filtered through the small loft window. I broke it open, peering down the barrel. Clean enough, no obvious obstructions. But without shells, it was just an awkward club. Where would I have put ammunition? Think, John, think. A small tin box came to mind, the one where I kept odd valuables and emergency supplies. I scrabbled through the loft items until I found it, prying open the rusty lid with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled among old photos and important papers, lay a small cardboard box of shotgun shells, half full. I nearly wept at the sight. With fumbling haste, I loaded 2 shells into the gun, the satisfying click of each round sliding home the most beautiful sound I'd ever heard. A loud thud from below jolted me to attention. They were testing the door, pushing against my makeshift barricade. The table legs scraped against the floor as the door opened an inch before catching on the obstruction. "He's barricaded it," the heavier man growled. "Want me to break a window?" "No," the thin man replied. "Too much noise. We'll get through the door." I eased back down the ladder, shotgun cradled in my good arm, and positioned myself across from the entrance. The limited space of the cabin left few tactical options. I had one advantage. In the darkness, I knew every inch of this place by heart. The door shuddered as something heavy slammed against it. The table legs skidded another inch across the floor. Another impact, and the wooden latch splintered audibly. "We're coming in," the thin man announced, as if he were a dinner guest politely giving warning. "Put down whatever you've got, and we'll make it quick." The calm in his voice chilled me more than any shouting could have. These weren't hot-headed attackers acting on impulse. They were methodical, practiced. The dead hiker hadn't been their first victim, and they didn't intend for me to be their last witness. I raised the shotgun, bracing it against my injured shoulder despite the pain. My finger rested lightly on the trigger as another blow struck the door, wood cracking along the frame. "Last chance," I called out, my voice steadier than I felt. "Walk away now." Their response was another powerful hit that sent the table skidding backward. The door flew open several inches, enough for the thin man to wedge his knife through the gap, working to push the table further aside. I aimed at the opening and waited, forcing myself to breathe slowly. The next few seconds would determine everything. The door burst inward with a crash as both men put their weight against it, sending the table tumbling over. They rushed in together, the thin man leading with his knife extended, the heavier one right behind with the pipe raised high. Time seemed to slow. I saw every detail with preternatural clarity. The gleam of moonlight on the knife blade, the dark stains on the pipe that I now recognized as dried blood, the wild determination in their eyes. I squeezed the trigger. The shotgun's roar filled the small cabin, deafening in the enclosed space. The thin man took the blast directly in the chest, the force lifting him off his feet and throwing him backward into his partner. Both men crashed into the doorframe in a tangle of limbs. For a moment, nobody moved. Then the thin man slid to the floor, knife clattering from lifeless fingers, a dark stain spreading across his yellow jacket. His eyes stared upward, seeing nothing. The heavier man struggled to extricate himself, stunned by the sudden violence but apparently unharmed. He looked at his fallen companion, then at me, his face transforming with rage and disbelief. "You," he began, raising the pipe again. I pumped the shotgun, chambering the second shell, the sound cutting off whatever he'd been about to say. Our eyes met across the dead man's body. He saw something in mine that made him hesitate. I fired again, The second blast tore through the cabin wall as the heavier man dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the full force of the shot. Splinters and debris filled the air, along with the acrid smell of gunpowder. My ears rang painfully from the twin explosions in the confined space. A pained grunt told me I hadn't missed entirely. The heavier man staggered outside, one hand pressed to his side. I pumped the shotgun again, but realized with sinking dread that I had no more shells in the chamber. The remaining ammunition was still upstairs in the loft. For a heartbeat, I stood frozen, the empty weapon still raised. The thin man lay motionless by the door, a grim testament to what happens when flesh meets buckshot at close range. His blood pooled on my plank floor, black in the dim light. Outside, I heard labored breathing and muttered curses. The heavier man was wounded but alive, and now he knew I'd fired my last shot. I had seconds at most before he recovered enough to come at me again. I dropped the shotgun and grabbed the kitchen knife from the counter, a poor replacement but better than nothing. My injured arm throbbed mercilessly, the dish towel bandage now soaked through with blood. Lightheadedness threatened to overwhelm me as adrenaline battled blood loss. "You're dead," the man outside growled, his voice tight with pain. "You hear me? Fucking dead!" I moved to the doorway, knife held before me, and peered cautiously into the darkness. The clearing around my cabin was washed in pale moonlight, shadows stretching long across the leaf-strewn ground. The heavier man had retreated to the edge of the trees, about 20 yards away. He stood hunched, one hand still clutched to his side, the other gripping the metal pipe. Blood stained his gray shirt in a spreading pattern. The shotgun pellets had caught him along the ribs. Not immediately fatal, but serious enough that he needed medical attention sooner rather than later. That knowledge didn't seem to have dampened his rage, however. His eyes, visible even in the darkness, burned with hatred. "You can't run," he said. "You know that, right? Even if you kill me, they'll find you." "They?" I echoed, the word slipping out before I could stop it. A grim smile twisted his features. "You think it's just us? You think we're alone out here?" He gestured vaguely toward the darkened forest. "There's more. Always more." Was he bluffing? Trying to rattle me? Or was there truth in his words? I thought about the dead hiker, about how methodically these two had tracked me. They weren't random killers. They had purpose, perhaps even organization. "The ranger station knows I'm here," I lied, keeping my voice steady. "They check on me weekly. They'll be coming soon." He laughed, a harsh sound that ended in a pained cough. "Nobody knows you're here, mountain man. Nobody cares. You disappeared from the world, remember? That's why you came out here, to vanish." The truth in his words stung worse than my wound. I had deliberately severed my connections to the outside world, left no forwarding address, maintained no regular contact with anyone. My isolation, once a comfort, now felt like a noose tightening around my neck. We stood at an impasse, him too injured to rush me too wounded to pursue him. The night stretched silent around us, indifferent to our bloody standoff. "Walk away," I said finally. "You're bleeding badly. Get help and I won't come after you." "Generous," he spat. "But we both know how this ends. One of us doesn't leave these woods." He straightened slightly, seeming to gather his strength. I tensed, preparing for another attack. But instead of charging, he backed further into the tree line, his form gradually blending with the shadows. "This isn't over," his voice floated back, already sounding fainter. "Not by a long shot." Then he was gone, swallowed by the darkness of the forest that had been my sanctuary and now felt like a prison. I stood in the doorway for long minutes, straining to hear any sound of his return. But the night offered only the usual chorus of insects and the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. Finally, the shock began to wear off, and the full impact of what had happened hit me like a physical blow. I stumbled back inside, careful to step around the dead man's body, and collapsed onto my cot. My hands shook uncontrollably as I unwrapped the blood-soaked towel from my arm to examine the damage. The knife wound was deep but clean, a straight slice about 4 inches long that had narrowly missed major blood vessels. It needed stitches, but I'd have to make do with what I had. I cleaned it as best I could with water and the bottle of whiskey I kept for medicinal purposes, biting down on a leather belt to keep from crying out as the alcohol scorched the open flesh. From my sparse medical supplies, I found butterfly bandages and wound closure strips. Not ideal, but they would have to suffice. I pulled the edges of the wound together, securing them with the strips, then wrapped the whole arm in clean bandaging, cinching it tight enough to control bleeding without cutting off circulation. My shoulder throbbed where the pipe had struck it, but nothing felt broken, just bruised muscle and perhaps a hairline fracture that would heal with time. I swallowed 2 ibuprofen tablets dry, knowing they'd hardly touch the pain, but needing to do something, anything, to maintain control. Only then did I allow myself to look at the dead man by my door. In death, he seemed smaller somehow, crumpled against the doorframe in an awkward pose, his yellow jacket now more red than yellow. His face was turned away, for which I was grateful. I'd seen enough death for one night. What was I supposed to do now? The obvious answer, call the police, wasn't an option for my isolated cabin. The nearest landline was at the gas station, 15 miles away through dark forest, with a wounded killer potentially waiting in the trees. Even if I made it, what would I say? That I'd killed a man in self-defense after finding a murder victim in the woods? That there might be others out there, as the heavier man had implied? I needed evidence. Something to corroborate my story when I eventually reported this nightmare to authorities. The hiker's backpack, the body by the creek, these would support my account, assuming the killers didn't return to remove them. A new urgency gripped me. I needed to document everything before anything changed. I lit several oil lamps, illuminating the cabin in a warm, flickering glow that made the blood look almost black against the wooden floor. I found my old digital camera in a drawer, rarely used but still functional, its battery holding enough charge for what I needed. I forced myself to photograph everything. The dead man and his knife, the damage to my door, my own injuries, the shotgun and spent shells. Each click of the shutter felt like another nail in a coffin, sealing away any chance I had of returning to my peaceful existence. When the grim task was complete, I faced my next dilemma. The body. I couldn't leave it where it lay, not with the potential for the wounded man to return with reinforcements, not with the autumn heat that would accelerate decomposition. But moving it seemed equally impossible. Where would I put it? How would I explain if I was caught in the act? In the end, practicality won out. I grabbed a tarp from my storage area, laid it beside the body, and with great effort, rolled the dead man onto it. His lifeless weight was shocking, so much heavier than a living person of the same size would be. I wrapped the tarp around him, securing it with rope, trying to distance myself mentally from what I was doing. I dragged the bundle outside to the small shed behind my cabin, clearing a space among my tools and supplies. It wasn't a permanent solution, but it would have to do until morning when I could better assess my options. Back inside, I scrubbed at the bloodstains on the floor, knowing I could never remove them completely from the porous wood. The physical labor helped distract me from the throbbing pain in my arm and the chaos of my thoughts. What had I stumbled into? Who were these men, and why had they killed the hiker? The heavier man's implication that they weren't alone nagged at me, raising disturbing possibilities. Was there some kind of organized operation in these woods? Drug manufacturing, perhaps, or something even darker? As I cleaned, a terrible thought struck me. What if they knew who I was? What if they'd been watching my cabin for days or weeks, learning my routines, waiting for the right moment? The forest suddenly felt transparent, my every move exposed. I checked my windows, pulled down the few curtains I had, and extinguished all but one lamp. The darkness offered little comfort now, but at least it would hide me from watching eyes outside. Sleep was out of the question. I retrieved the remaining shotgun shells from the loft and reloaded the weapon, then positioned myself on a chair facing the door, determined to remain vigilant until dawn. The kitchen knife lay on the small table beside me, a backup I hoped not to need. Hours crawled by. Every creak of settling wood, every rustle of nocturnal animals outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through my system. Twice, I thought I heard footsteps and raised the shotgun, only to realize it was just the wind, or my own frayed nerves playing tricks. As the first hint of dawn lightened the eastern sky, I allowed myself to believe I might have survived the night. The heavier man hadn't returned. Perhaps his wounds were more serious than I'd thought, or perhaps he decided I wasn't worth the risk. But the day ahead loomed with impossible choices. Should I hike out to report what happened, leaving my cabin unguarded? Should I try to find the hiker's body again, gathering more evidence? Or should I simply flee, abandoning everything I'd built here and disappearing deeper into the wilderness? As gray light filtered through my windows, I realized that no option led back to the life I'd known. Whatever I chose, everything had changed. The isolation I'd sought had become a trap, and the peace I'd found was shattered beyond repair. I checked my bandaged arm, wincing as I flexed my fingers. The bleeding had stopped, but infection remained a serious concern. I'd need antibiotics soon, another reason to risk the journey to civilization. The dawn chorus of birds began outside, a jarring normalcy against the horror of the night. I rose stiffly from my chair, muscles protesting after hours of tense immobility. My decision crystallized with the growing light. I would hike out, report everything, and face whatever consequences came. The alternative, living in fear, looking over my shoulder, wondering when they might return, was no life at all. I gathered essential supplies into a small backpack: water, food, the camera with its grim documentation, a change of bandages for my arm, and a crude map I'd drawn of the area, marking both my cabin and approximately where I'd found the hiker's body. The shotgun I would carry openly, illegal in the national forest under normal circumstances, but these were far from normal circumstances. As I stepped outside into the cool morning air, the forest appeared unchanged. Ancient trees standing sentinel, mist curling between their trunks, dew glistening on spider webs strung between branches. Beautiful and indifferent to the violence that had transpired beneath its canopy. I locked my cabin door out of habit, though the splintered frame rendered it largely symbolic. With one last look at the place I'd called home, I turned east toward the rising sun and the long walk back to the world I'd left behind. Whatever waited for me there couldn't be worse than what lurked in these woods. At least, that's what I told myself as I took the first steps of my journey, shotgun cradled in my arms, senses alert for any sound of pursuit. The truth, as I would soon discover, was far more complicated and far more terrifying than I could have imagined. The 15-mile hike to the gas station proved more arduous than I anticipated. My wounded arm throbbed with each heartbeat, a persistent reminder of the night's violence. The forest, once a sanctuary, now felt hostile. Every shadow potentially concealing watchers, every snapping twig signaling pursuit. I kept the shotgun ready, its weight both a burden and a comfort as I followed faint trails eastward. By midday, fever had set in. My forehead burned while chills racked my body, clear signs of infection taking hold in my knife wound. The makeshift bandage had soaked through again, and when I paused to change it beside a small stream, the edges of the cut showed angry red inflammation. I cleaned it as best I could with stream water, applied my last antibiotic ointment, and rewrapped it with a fresh bandage from my pack. "Just keep moving," I muttered to myself, the sound of my voice startling in the quiet forest. One foot in front of the other. The terrain grew steeper as I approached the ridgeline that separated my valley from the more traveled areas of the national forest. Climbing with one good arm proved challenging, and twice I slipped on loose shale, reopening my wound and adding scrapes and bruises to my growing collection of injuries. By late afternoon, I reached the fire road that would lead to Route 66 and civilization. The packed dirt track felt unnervingly exposed after hours in the dense forest cover. I quickened my pace despite my exhaustion, driven by the irrational fear that I was being watched from the tree line. The sun was setting when I finally spotted the weathered, clapboard structure of Roy's Gas and Grocery, its single pump and faded sign a surreal vision of normalcy after what I'd experienced. A battered pickup truck sat in the gravel lot. Roy's vehicle, I assumed, but no other cars were present. I hesitated at the edge of the forest, suddenly aware of how I must appear. Unshaven, filthy, bloody, carrying a shotgun and looking half wild. In my isolated life, I'd forgotten how frightening such an image would be to regular people. To avoid being shot on sight, I reluctantly stashed the shotgun in the underbrush, marking the location in my mind. I'd retrieve it later if needed. The bell above the door jingled as I entered the store. Roy looked up from his crossword puzzle, recognition slowly dawning on his weathered face. "Mountain man," he said. Then his eyes widened as he took in my condition. "What in God's name happened to you?" "I need to use your phone," I said, my voice hoarse from disuse and dehydration. "Need to call the police." Roy didn't ask questions. He led me behind the counter and pointed to an ancient rotary phone mounted on the wall. "You need an ambulance too, by the looks of it." I nodded gratefully and dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The dispatcher's voice sounded tinny and distant, a connection to a world that suddenly felt foreign. 911, what's your emergency?" "My name is John Erskine," I began, the words tumbling out faster than I could organize them. I live in a cabin in the Allegheny National Forest. Yesterday evening, I found a dead body near my property. 2 men chased me. They tried to kill me. I shot one of them. The other got away wounded. A pause then. Sir, are you currently in danger? I don't think so. I'm at Roy's Gas and Grocery off Route 66, near the eastern forest boundary. Stay where you are, sir. I'm dispatching officers and an ambulance to your location. They should arrive in approximately 20 minutes. After I hung up, Roy guided me to a chair by the window, his face grave. He didn't press for details, just brought me a bottle of water and a first aid kit from behind the counter. Been telling you for years these woods ain't right, he said quietly as he helped me clean my wound properly. Some folks go in and never come out. I wanted to dismiss his words as the superstitious ramblings of a country store owner, but after what I'd seen, I couldn't. Instead, I asked, have there been others? Other disappearances? Roy shrugged. Official ones. A few hikers every couple years. Rangers say they got lost. Happens in wilderness areas. Unofficial ones. He glanced toward the darkening forest visible through the window. More than anyone knows. Before I could question him further, red and blue lights flashed in the distance, growing brighter as vehicles approached the store. The cavalry had arrived, though I had no idea if they'd believe my story or dismiss me as a paranoid hermit who'd cracked under the isolation. 2 state police cruisers pulled into the gravel lot, followed by an ambulance. Officers approached cautiously, hands near their holstered weapons, a reasonable precaution given the situation I'd described. The next few hours passed in a blur. Paramedics treated my arm, confirming my self-diagnosis of infection and administering IV antibiotics on site before transporting me to the regional hospital 30 miles away. State police detectives interviewed me in the emergency room, their expressions growing increasingly concerned as I detailed finding the hiker's body, the chase through the forest, and the deadly confrontation at my cabin. You say you left one assailant's body in your shed? Detective Mercer, a tall woman with short gray hair and skeptical eyes, asked. Yes, and I photographed everything. I pointed to my backpack, where the digital camera still waited with its grim evidence. The other man escaped, but he was wounded. Shotgun pellets caught him in the side. And you believe these men killed the hiker you found? I'm certain of it. They as much as admitted it when they came after me. Mercer exchanged glances with her partner, a younger man named Walsh, whose notepad was filled with my statement. Mr. Erskine, we'll need you to guide us back to your cabin and the location where you found the initial victim. When? As soon as the doctor clears you. We've already dispatched a forensics team to secure the area based on the coordinates you provided. I nodded, fighting against the exhaustion and medication that threatened to pull me under. There's something else. The one who got away, he implied they weren't alone. Said there were others. Walsh leaned forward. Others? Like what, some kind of group? I don't know, but he seemed confident, said they'll find you as if he was part of something larger. Mercer's expression darkened. We've had reports of unusual activity in the eastern section of the forest over the past year. Nothing concrete enough for an investigation, but concerning patterns. What kind of patterns? I asked. Missing hikers who were experienced outdoorsmen, evidence of unauthorized structures deep in restricted areas, unusual vehicle traffic on service roads with no clear purpose. She hesitated, then added, and reports from hunters about finding game that had been killed but not harvested, just left to rot with specific, ritual-like markings. A chill ran through me despite the hospital's warmth. Do you think there's some kind of cult operating out there? I wouldn't use that word officially, Mercer replied carefully. But unofficially, we're concerned about organized activity of an extreme nature, yes. The doctor interrupted then, insisting I needed rest before any forest expedition. The detectives reluctantly agreed to return in the morning, leaving an officer stationed outside my hospital room. For my protection, they assured me, though it felt equally like preventing my escape. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by nightmares of being chased through endless trees by faceless figures. I awoke before dawn, disoriented in the sterile hospital environment so different from my rustic cabin. By mid-morning, I'd been cleared for release, my arm properly stitched and bandaged, antibiotics coursing through my system via a portable IV drip the doctors insisted I continue for at least 48 hours. Detectives Mercer and Walsh returned with a forest ranger named Alvarez who would help navigate back to my cabin. The drive through the national forest felt surreal. Main roads gave way to service roads, then to the fire road I'd hiked out on the previous day. Finally, we reached the point where vehicles could go no further, and we continued on foot, following trails I knew by heart, but now saw through new eyes. "You really lived out here all alone?" Ranger Alvarez asked as we hiked, his tone somewhere between admiration and concern. "For almost 3 years," I replied. "Why?" The question came from Walsh, who'd been largely silent during the journey. I considered deflecting, but the events of the past 2 days had stripped away any pretense. I was running from something I couldn't face. Thought I'd find peace in isolation. "And did you?" Mercer asked. "Until 2 days ago? Yes, mostly." We fell silent after that, conserving energy for the hike. As we approached the creek where I'd first found the backpack, tension built within me. What if the body was gone? What if there was no evidence to support my story? My fears proved unfounded. The bright red backpack remained where I'd found it, though animals had scattered its contents further. And the hiker's body lay exactly as I'd left it, now covered with a light dusting of fallen leaves like nature's funeral shroud. Mercer crouched beside the dead man, her expression grim. Blunt force trauma to the back of the skull, defensive wounds on the hands. This was no accident. She spoke into her radio, summoning the forensics team that had been staging nearby. Within minutes, the quiet clearing became a hive of activity as technicians in blue jumpsuits photographed, measured, and collected evidence. We continued to my cabin, where a similar scene awaited. The thin man's body had been removed from my shed and lay wrapped in a body bag near a coroner's vehicle that had somehow navigated the rough terrain. Inside the cabin, technicians dusted for fingerprints and cataloged the blood spatter pattern from the shotgun blast. "Everything matches your statement, Mr. Erskine," Mercer acknowledged, a new respect in her voice. "But we still need to find the second assailant." "You think he's still out here? With those injuries?" "He would have needed medical attention. We've alerted hospitals in a 100-mile radius, but so far, nothing." I gazed around at the forest surrounding my small clearing, suddenly aware of how vast and impenetrable it truly was. If what he said is true about others, they might have their own medical supplies, their own facilities. Mercer nodded slowly. "That's our concern as well." Over the next week, my small cabin became the center of an expanding investigation. The dead hiker was identified as Gregory Voss, a 32-year-old environmental engineer from Pittsburgh who had been reported missing after failing to return from a weekend hike. The thin man I'd killed was identified through fingerprints as Wesley Simmons, 41, with a record of assault and suspected ties to extremist groups. I stayed at a motel in the nearest town, giving daily statements as investigators pieced together what had happened. They brought in specialists from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, experts in tracking organized violent groups operating in remote areas. 10 days after the incident, Mercer invited me to a briefing at the state police headquarters. A conference room had been transformed into an incident command center, with maps of the national forest covering one wall, marked with pins indicating known locations of interest. "We believe we've identified an encampment approximately 7 miles northwest of your cabin," Mercer explained, pointing to a red circle on the map. "Aerial surveillance shows evidence of structures and activity well outside permitted camping areas." "What kind of activity?" I asked. An FBI agent named Powell stepped forward. "Based on satellite imagery and thermal scanning, we estimate between 15 and 20 individuals. They've constructed semi-permanent shelters, dug waste pits, created what appears to be a defensive perimeter. Are they armed?" Powell nodded grimly. "Almost certainly. We've intercepted encrypted radio communications suggesting a well-organized group with military-style protocols." "Who are they?" Mercer exchanged glances with Powell before responding. "We believe they're part of a larger network called the Forest Brotherhood, an extremist survivalist group with apocalyptic beliefs. They see wilderness areas as the last bastion against what they consider societal collapse." "And they kill hikers?" I asked incredulously. "They kill anyone they consider a threat to their territory," Powell clarified. "Their ideology combines extreme anti-government views with nature worship and isolationism. They believe they're the rightful stewards of the forest." I thought about my own retreat from society, how I'd sought isolation as a refuge. Had I been unconsciously mimicking the very group that had nearly killed me? "What happens now?" I asked. "We're planning a coordinated operation to secure the encampment," Mercer said. "State police tactical units with FBI support. It's scheduled for tomorrow at dawn." "And me?" What should I do? Powell studied me with calculating eyes. That depends. Are you planning to return to your cabin? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought that far ahead, had been existing in a stunned day-to-day survival mode since the attack. I don't know, I admitted. Can I? Physically, yes. Once the investigation concludes, the property remains yours. But psychologically? Powell shrugged. That's something only you can decide. That night, alone in my sterile motel room with its buzzing fluorescent lights and paper-thin walls, I faced the question head-on. Could I return to my solitary existence after what had happened? Would the forest ever feel like sanctuary again? Or would every shadow hide potential threats, every unexpected sound trigger memories of that night? More importantly, should I return? My retreat to isolation had been a response to trauma, a way of avoiding responsibility and human connection. It had felt like wisdom at the time, but now I wondered if it had just been elaborate cowardice. Dawn broke with the sound of helicopter rotors passing overhead. The operation against the Forest Brotherhood encampment was underway. I watched through my window as military-style vehicles rolled through town, heading toward the National Forest. Hours later, Mercer called to report success. 12 members of the group had been arrested without casualties. Others had escaped deeper into the wilderness but were being tracked. Among those captured was the heavier man from that night, still recovering from his shotgun wounds. His name was Russell Blackwell, a former Army Ranger discharged for disciplinary reasons who had been with the Forest Brotherhood for at least 3 years. He's talking, Mercer told me, trying to cut a deal. Says the group has killed at least 7 people who ventured too close to their territory over the past year. Was I a target? I asked. Did they know about me before I found the hiker? According to Blackwell, they knew about your cabin but considered you a kindred spirit, someone else who'd rejected society. They left you alone until you witnessed them with Voss's body. The irony wasn't lost on me. My isolation had both protected and endangered me, marking me as similar to the killers while simultaneously making me vulnerable when they turned on me. A week later, after giving final statements and signing countless documents, I returned to my cabin with a police escort. The crime scene tape had been removed, but evidence of the investigation remained. Boot prints in the dirt, fingerprint powder on surfaces, the lingering smell of chemicals used to detect blood traces. The officers offered to stay while I gathered personal belongings, assuming I wouldn't want to remain. I thanked them, but declined. I needed to be alone with the place, to feel whether it was still home or simply the scene of a nightmare. After they left, I stood in the center of my small clearing as evening approached. The forest stretched around me, ancient trees indifferent to the human drama that had played out beneath them. Birds called, squirrels chattered, leaves rustled in the gentle breeze, the eternal conversation of the woodland continuing as it had for centuries. I walked the perimeter of my property, touching familiar trees, noting how quickly nature had begun reclaiming the areas disturbed by the investigation. Near the creek where I'd found Voss's body, wildflowers had already started growing over the trampled ground. Inside the cabin, I lit a fire in the wood stove and sat before it on my simple wooden chair. The bloodstains had been cleaned from the floor, the broken door repaired by the forensics team after they finished their work. Yet the space felt irreparably altered, as if the violence had seeped into the very logs. As darkness fell, I made my decision. This chapter of my life had ended the moment I found that backpack by the creek. Staying would mean living with ghosts, both literal and metaphorical, and perpetuating a retreat from life that had proven more dangerous than healing. The next morning I began packing the few possessions I wanted to keep. My grandfather's pocket watch, journals I'd kept during my time here, tools handed down through generations. The rest, furniture, supplies, the structure itself, I would leave behind, perhaps for another seeker who needed temporary refuge but not permanent escape. 2 weeks later, I signed paperwork donating the cabin and surrounding acre to a wilderness education program for troubled youth. The irony felt appropriate. What had been my hiding place would become a place of growth and reconnection for others. I moved to a small town on the edge of the forest, close enough to visit the woods on day hikes, but firmly within the realm of community and connection. I found work as a carpenter's assistant, using skills honed during my solitary years for something productive. In the evenings, I began writing about my experiences, first as therapy, then as something that might help others understand the fine line between healthy solitude and dangerous isolation. Sometimes at night, I still dream of that evening. Finding the body, the chase through darkening woods, the desperate struggle in my cabin. I wake with my heart pounding, sheets damp with sweat, momentarily disoriented until the sound of distant traffic or a neighbor's radio grounds me in the present. But those episodes grow less frequent with time. What remains more persistent is a heightened awareness of shadows in peripheral vision, of subtle changes in forest sounds, of the capacity for darkness that exists in isolated minds. The investigation into the Forest Brotherhood continued for months, uncovering a network that stretched across multiple national forests in the eastern United States. More arrests followed. More evidence of killings emerged. I testified at several trials, facing Russell Blackwell across courtrooms as he glared at me with undimmed hatred. During the final trial, he spoke directly to me during his statement to the court. "You think you've escaped, but you're still one of us. Still a man who ran from the world. The only difference is you ran back when things got hard." His words haunted me, containing just enough truth to sting. But over time, I recognized the fundamental difference between us. I had sought isolation to heal, while he and his brotherhood had sought it to nurture hatred and violence. My retreat had been a temporary shelter. Theirs was a fortress built to wage war. Now, 3 years since that blood-soaked night, I walk in the forest with open eyes, neither fearing its depths nor idealizing its solitude. The woods are neither malevolent nor benevolent. They simply are, vast and ancient and indifferent to human concerns. They can shelter both the healer and the killer, the seeker and the lost. I no longer live alone, but I haven't forgotten what solitude taught me, that we need both connection and space, community and individuality, to be fully human. The forest remains a part of my life, but as a place I visit rather than a place I hide. Sometimes, on clear autumn days when the leaves begin to turn, I hike near my old cabin. The education program has maintained it well, adding solar panels and improving the water collection system. Young voices echo where once there was only silence, learning the names of trees and the habits of wildlife, discovering that nature can be both teacher and healer. I never stay long, never visit after dusk. Some memories are best left undisturbed, like the leaves that cover the forest floor, gradually decomposing to nourish new growth. The past remains, feeding the present, but no longer defining it. As I turn to leave, I sometimes pause at the ridge overlooking the small valley where I once made my solitary home. The forest stretches in all directions, beautiful and mysterious and complex, much like the human heart that seeks both connection and solitude, safety and risk, retreat and return. I take a deep breath of pine-scented air, adjust my pack, and head back toward town, toward light and noise and the messy miracle of human community. The path leads forward, not back. And despite everything, I wouldn't have it any other way. I never considered myself someone who collected dolls. Throughout my childhood, toys held little fascination for me. While other girls my age accumulated stuffed animals and plastic figurines, I found myself drawn to books and outdoor adventures. The few toys I did own could easily be counted on both hands, and by the time I turned 14, I had given most away to younger cousins in the family. The larger of my 2 porcelain dolls came into my possession when I was 10 years old, a birthday gift from my closest friend, Jade. We had been inseparable since first grade, sharing secrets and spending countless afternoons exploring the woods behind my house. The doll arrived in an ornate box, its face hauntingly lifelike with pale, unblemished skin and deep, almost iridescent blue eyes that seemed to shift color depending on how the light hit them. "This isn't just any doll," my grandmother informed me after the birthday party had ended. She held it carefully, her weathered hands contrasting with the doll's pristine features. "Porcelain dolls like this one are collector's items. They're meant to be displayed, not played with." I nodded, somewhat indifferent at the time. The doll wore an elaborate Victorian-style dress of deep burgundy with intricate lace details and a matching wide-brimmed hat that cast shadows across its face when positioned just so. I placed it on my dresser, where it remained largely forgotten as I continued my ordinary 10-year-old life. The smaller doll joined my reluctant collection approximately 2 years later as an Easter gift from my grandmother. Unlike its counterpart, this doll featured softer features, rosy cheeks, a gentle smile, and light brown hair arranged in perfect ringlets. My 2 sisters received identical dolls that Easter morning, though theirs mysteriously disappeared within months. whether lost during our frequent relocations or deliberately misplaced due to growing discomfort. Neither sister seemed particularly troubled by their absence. I've now had these dolls for nearly 12 years. I'm 24 as I document these experiences, having carried these porcelain companions through 3 different homes, 2 college dormitories, and now my first apartment. During this time, I've accumulated a series of incidents that I can no longer dismiss as coincidence or imagination. What follows is my attempt to chronicle these events in the hope that committing them to paper might provide some clarity, or at the very least, a record should the occurrences continue to escalate. Our log cabin home sat nestled against the edge of dense woodland, the kind of picturesque rural setting that appears idyllic in daylight, but transforms into something altogether more sinister after sunset. We had lived there approximately 3 years when my sisters came to live with us following my parents' separation. The adjustment period was challenging as we established new routines and boundaries. The cabin's rustic charm extended to creaking floorboards and settling noises that became the soundtrack of our nights. At first, we attributed every unexpected sound to the natural movements of an aging wooden structure. However, certain occurrences defied such rational explanations. The first incident I can recall with absolute clarity happened during a thunderstorm in late autumn. Power outages were common in our remote location, so we had gathered in the living room with flashlights and candles, telling ghost stories to pass the time. My younger sister Irene, 13 at the time, had just finished recounting a particularly chilling tale when the conversation turned to items in our home that made them uncomfortable. "That porcelain doll on your dresser," Irene said, her voice lowering instinctively. "The way it watches from under that hat. I can't stand being alone in your room with it." My middle sister Vanessa nodded in agreement. "Every time I walk past your room, I feel like it's following me with its eyes." I laughed dismissively. "It's just a doll. It's not even particularly well made. Most of its eyelashes have fallen off." "Would you mind pushing the hat down over its face when we're home?" Irene asked. "Just so it isn't looking at us." To humor them, I agreed, though I found their concern amusing. I had owned the larger doll for nearly 4 years by then, and had never felt anything unsettling about it. My more spiritually inclined friend Renee had once suggested that perhaps the dolls had formed some attachment to me as their owner. This explanation seemed fanciful, but harmless. That night, after the power returned and my sisters had fallen asleep, I sat at my desk completing homework. From the corner of my eye, I noticed something unusual. The doll's hat had shifted slightly, exposing one glazed eye that seemed to be angled directly toward me. I distinctly remembered pushing the hat down as promised, making sure both eyes were completely covered. Dismissing it as a result of the house settling, or perhaps my own imperfect memory, I approached the doll and readjusted its hat. As my fingers brushed against the porcelain face, I noted with surprise that it felt unusually warm to the touch, almost as if it retained body heat. The scientific part of my mind immediately sought explanations. Perhaps it had been sitting near my reading lamp, absorbing heat from the bulb. I returned to my homework, but found myself unable to concentrate, repeatedly glancing back at the doll on my dresser. That night, for the first time, I turned it to face the wall before going to sleep. In the following weeks, I began noticing small irregularities. Items on my dresser would be slightly rearranged. The doll's hat would be raised, despite my consistent efforts to keep it lowered. Once, I returned from school to find the doll had rotated approximately 45 degrees from its previous position. When I mentioned these observations casually to my grandmother, she dismissed them with practical explanations: the house settling, drafts from the poorly sealed windows, or perhaps my sisters entering my room despite our agreement about personal space. These explanations satisfied me temporarily, but couldn't account for what happened next. Within months of moving in, both of my sisters had developed elaborate rituals before entering my bedroom. Irene would knock 3 times, call my name, and wait for a response before crossing the threshold. Vanessa refused to enter unless I was physically present in the room. When questioned about these behaviors, both admitted their discomfort stemmed from the porcelain dolls. "They watch us," Vanessa explained one evening as we prepared dinner together. "Not just the way normal dolls seem to stare. They actively track movement." "That's impossible," I countered, slicing vegetables with perhaps more force than necessary. "They're inanimate objects." "Then why do you always find the hat raised when you've pushed it down?" she challenged. "And why does the smaller one always end up facing the door, no matter which way you position it?" I had no satisfactory answer, having noticed these phenomena myself, but dismissed them as coincidence or faulty memory. The following weekend, Irene approached me with an unusually serious expression. "Something happened yesterday when you were at swim practice," she began, fidgeting with her bracelet. "I needed to borrow your graphing calculator for math homework. I called for Grandma, but she was in the garden and couldn't hear me." She paused, seeming to gather courage before continuing. "I stood at your doorway for almost 5 minutes, trying to work up the nerve to go in alone. The larger doll was on your dresser where it always is, but something felt different. The atmosphere in your room felt pressurized somehow, like the air before a severe storm." Irene described how she finally entered, keeping her eyes averted from the dresser as she moved toward my desk. I found the calculator and turned to leave, but something compelled me to look at the doll. The hat was raised completely, and I absolutely swear, its head had turned to follow my movement across the room. She had dropped the calculator and fled downstairs, refusing to return to the second floor until our grandmother or I was home. When I checked later, the calculator lay on the floor precisely where she claimed to have dropped it, and the doll sat on the dresser with its hat fully raised, though I had lowered it before leaving that morning. That night, I conducted a simple experiment. Before going to bed, I positioned both dolls facing the wall, measuring the exact distance between them and marking their positions with small strips of tape on the dresser surface. I took photographs with my phone to document their arrangement. When I woke the next morning, the smaller doll remained in position, but the larger one had rotated approximately 30 degrees toward my bed. The tape marker remained in place, indicating the doll had moved without disturbing its base. I checked my phone. The photograph confirmed my memory wasn't faulty. Something had shifted the doll's position during the night. The summer I turned 17, I traveled to Florida to stay with relatives for 6 weeks. Before leaving, I made special arrangements for my dolls at my sister's insistence. I placed the larger doll facing my bed with its hat pulled down completely over its face. The smaller doll I positioned on a bookshelf, facing away from the room entirely. My sisters shared the large bedroom with me in our log cabin home, a spacious area that accommodated 3 full-sized beds, a futon, television, and 3 dressers with room to spare. Despite sharing this space, they requested these specific arrangements to ensure their comfort during my absence. 2 weeks into my trip, I received a disturbing phone call from Vanessa. Her voice trembled as she recounted what had occurred earlier that day. "I was coming up the stairs to get my laptop charger," she began, her words rushing together. "You know how the staircase has that landing where you can see into our room through the banister? Well, I was about halfway up when I glanced over." She paused, and I could hear her taking deep breaths to steady herself. "The larger doll was sitting on your dresser, facing the staircase directly. Its hat was completely raised, and its head, I swear this is true, was angled downward as if it was watching me climb the stairs. I know exactly how we left it before you left. Irene and I both made sure of it." Vanessa described how she had frozen on the stairs, unable to continue upward or retreat back down for several terrifying seconds. When she finally regained control of her limbs, she raced back down to the kitchen where our grandmother was preparing lunch. "The worst part," she continued, "is what Irene told me afterward. She swears that 2 days ago she found the doll sitting on your bed, partially covered by your blankets as if it had crawled under them itself. She put it back on the dresser, fixed the hat, and didn't tell me because she thought I'd done it as a prank." This revelation disturbed me more than I wanted to admit. My grandmother, ever practical, suggested that perhaps one of them had moved the doll subconsciously or forgotten doing so. When I returned home 3 weeks later, I found the larger doll exactly where Vanessa described, on the dresser, facing outward, with its hat raised to expose its glass eyes. The smaller doll, however, had disappeared entirely from the bookshelf. After a thorough search, I discovered it inside my closet, nestled between winter sweaters that hadn't been touched in months. That night, I experienced something that confirmed my sister's experiences weren't mere imagination. I awoke around 3 in the morning to the distinct sensation of being watched. The moonlight filtering through my curtains provided just enough illumination to make out shapes in the darkness. As my eyes adjusted, I realized with growing horror that both dolls now sat at the foot of my bed, their pale faces turned toward me. I remained perfectly still, convinced I must be dreaming or experiencing sleep paralysis. I forced myself to close my eyes and count slowly to 100. When I opened them again, the dolls had returned to their original positions, the larger one on the dresser, the smaller on the bookshelf. In the morning, I dismissed the incident as a particularly vivid nightmare. Yet the lingering doubt remained, intensified by the discovery of a small tear in my comforter precisely where I had seen the dolls sitting in my supposed dream. 2 years later, my family relocated to a modern 2-story home across town. The move represented a fresh start for all of us, away from the creaking floors and drafty windows of the log cabin. My bedroom in the new house was smaller but brighter, with large windows that eliminated the shadowy corners I had grown accustomed to. For the first time, I seriously considered not bringing the porcelain dolls. They sat in a moving box for nearly 3 weeks after we'd settled in, until guilt, or perhaps some inexplicable sense of obligation, compelled me to unpack them. I arranged them on a wooden bookshelf near my door, positioning them between novels so they appeared more like casual decorations than focal points. My grandmother, who lived with us, seemed relieved by the new home's solid construction and absence of unexplained noises. The first month passed uneventfully, leading us all to relax into our new routines. I had been accepted to a nearby university and was preparing for my freshman year, spending long hours studying and rarely paying attention to the dolls. One morning in early autumn, my grandmother approached me during breakfast with an unusual question. "Did you hear someone knocking in your room last night?" she asked, stirring her tea with unnecessary focus. "No," I replied, confused. "I slept through the night. Why?" She described waking around 2:30 a.m. to the distinct sound of knocking. Not gentle tapping, but deliberate, forceful impacts, as if someone were pounding a fist against wood. The sound had come from the direction of my bedroom, she was certain. "I thought perhaps your mini-fridge was malfunctioning," she continued. "Sometimes they make that knocking sound when the compressor is failing." Concerned, I checked the mini-fridge immediately after breakfast, but it was functioning perfectly. No unusual sounds or temperature issues. I inspected my entire room carefully, but found nothing that could explain the knocking my grandmother had heard. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was studying late in the living room when my grandmother appeared in the doorway, her face pale. "There's that knocking again," she whispered. "Coming from your room." Together we walked upstairs, but as we approached my bedroom, the sound abruptly ceased. My door stood partially open, exactly as I had left it. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed. The porcelain dolls sat on their shelf, their glassy eyes reflecting the hallway light. My grandmother, always practical and skeptical of supernatural explanations, suggested we check the attic access panel in the ceiling outside my room, thinking perhaps an animal had become trapped. We found nothing. She then proposed the knocking might be coming from the pipes within the walls, though the plumber who inspected them the following day found no issues. The knocking occurred twice more during the following week, always when I wasn't in my room and always stopping before I could reach the source. On the 5th occurrence, something different happened. My grandmother heard the now familiar pounding and immediately called for me. I sprinted upstairs, determined to catch whatever was causing the disturbance. As I reached the top step, I heard it clearly. 3 distinct knocks against wood, followed by silence, then 3 more. The sound emanated unquestionably from my bedroom. I pushed the door open fully and flipped on the light. The room appeared exactly as I had left it, with one exception. The smaller porcelain doll lay on the floor beneath the bookshelf, as if it had fallen or been thrown. Its tiny porcelain hand rested against the wooden baseboard, precisely the spot from which the knocking seemed to originate. I stood frozen in the doorway, unable to reconcile what I was seeing with what I knew to be possible. My grandmother appeared behind me, her breath catching as she observed the scene. "It must have fallen," she said finally, her voice strained. "The shelf might be uneven." I nodded mutely and entered the room to retrieve the doll. As I lifted it, I noticed something that made my stomach constrict. A small chip in its porcelain hand, fresh and sharp-edged, revealing the chalky white material beneath the glazed surface. The location of the chip aligned perfectly with where it would strike the baseboard if used to knock. That night, I packed both dolls carefully in a storage container and placed them in the back of my closet. Neither my grandmother nor I mentioned the incident again, as if by mutual, unspoken agreement. For several weeks, our home remained blissfully quiet at night. During my freshman year of college, I returned home primarily for holidays and occasional weekends. The dolls remained sealed in their container in my closet, undisturbed and largely forgotten as I adapted to campus life. My sisters had both moved out by then, Vanessa to attend a university on the opposite coast, and Irene to live with our father in another state. The Christmas break of my sophomore year brought an unexpected visitor to our home. Rebecca, a childhood friend who had moved away during middle school, had returned to town to visit relatives. Having reconnected through social media, she eagerly accepted my invitation for dinner at our house. The evening progressed pleasantly with conversation and reminiscing until Rebecca mentioned hearing about those creepy dolls from mutual friends. My grandmother tensed visibly across the table, but I laughed it off, explaining that my sisters had always been unnecessarily frightened by perfectly ordinary porcelain dolls. "I'd love to see them," Rebecca said, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I've always been fascinated by supposedly haunted objects." Reluctantly, I led her upstairs to my bedroom. The storage container remained untouched in my closet, gathering dust. I hesitated before opening it, surprised by my own reluctance. Rebecca watched eagerly as I removed the lid and carefully unwrapped the tissue paper surrounding the larger doll. Its face emerged from the wrappings, the painted features somehow more vivid than I remembered. The blue eyes caught the light, creating the illusion of depth where none should exist. Rebecca gasped appreciatively, reaching out to touch the fabric of its dress. "It's beautiful," she murmured. "Can I take a picture to show my mom? She collects antique dolls." I nodded absently, distracted by the smaller doll still nestled in tissue paper. Something about its position seemed wrong, though I couldn't immediately identify what bothered me. As Rebecca positioned her phone to photograph the larger doll, I realized what had caught my attention. The smaller doll's head had rotated within its wrappings, its face now pressed against the transparent plastic of the container as if peering outward. "Wait until I take it out completely," I said, reaching for the larger doll to position it better for the photograph. As I lifted it from the container, the hat fell back, exposing its face entirely. Rebecca aimed her phone and tapped the screen to focus. Suddenly, she jerked backward, nearly dropping her phone in the process. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice high with alarm. "See what?" Its eyes. They moved. Just as I took the picture, they flicked to the side, looking directly at the camera. I dismissed her claim immediately. "That's impossible. It's a fixed porcelain doll." Rebecca thrust her phone toward me, her hand trembling slightly. "Look at the picture. Tell me what you see." The photograph showed the doll held in my hands, its face clearly visible. What struck me was the direction of its gaze. While I remembered its eyes facing forward as they always had, in the image they were undeniably shifted toward the camera lens, creating the unsettling impression of direct eye contact with the viewer. "It's just the angle," I said firmly, though doubt crept through me. Or maybe a reflection on the glass eyes. Rebecca wasn't convinced. She insisted on taking another photograph, this time recording a short video as well. In the second image, the doll's eyes appeared normal, facing forward as expected. The video showed nothing unusual, just a porcelain doll held in my increasingly unsteady hands. After Rebecca left that evening, I examined the dolls more carefully. The smaller one had indeed shifted position within its wrappings, though I had sealed the container months ago and it had remained undisturbed in my closet. The larger doll's eyes appeared normal now, but I couldn't dismiss what I'd seen in the photograph. Against my better judgment, I decided to place them on my desk rather than return them to storage. Perhaps constant observation would provide answers to questions I had been avoiding for years. That night, I awoke to the sound of something scratching gently against wood. Keeping my breathing steady and my eyes nearly closed, I scanned the darkened room. The dolls remained on my desk, their outlines visible in the faint glow from my alarm clock. As I watched through half-lidded eyes, the scratching sound came again. The larger doll's arm moved, a tiny, almost imperceptible motion. Its porcelain hand dragged across the wooden surface of the desk, creating the scratching noise I had heard. I remained perfectly still, fear constricting my throat as I witnessed what should have been impossible. The doll's head rotated slowly until its eyes fixed on my position in the bed. Though I couldn't make out its expression clearly in the darkness, I felt with absolute certainty that it was aware of my consciousness. After what seemed like hours but was likely only minutes, I summoned the courage to reach for my bedside lamp. The instant light flooded the room. All movement ceased. Both dolls sat innocently on the desk, positioned exactly as I had left them before going to sleep. The following morning, I examined the desk surface carefully, finding 3 tiny scratch marks in the wood where the doll's hand had rested. The incidents grew more frequent after Rebecca's visit, as if her acknowledgement of the doll's strange properties had somehow emboldened them. I returned to university after the holiday break with a mixture of relief and guilt, having once again sealed the dolls in their container and placed them in my closet. My junior year brought new challenges and distractions that pushed thoughts of the dolls to the periphery of my consciousness. I moved into an off-campus apartment with 2 roommates, immersed myself in my studies, and began an internship that consumed most of my free time. For nearly 8 months, I managed to visit home only briefly, never staying overnight. When summer arrived, however, financial necessity required me to move back into my childhood bedroom temporarily. The storage container remained undisturbed in my closet, exactly where I had left it. For the first week, I avoided opening it, telling myself I had outgrown such childish fears. My grandmother noticed my avoidance but said nothing until one evening when we sat alone on the back porch, watching fireflies emerge in the gathering dusk. "They've been active while you were gone," she said quietly, not needing to specify what "they" referred to. I turned to her in surprise. My grandmother had always been the voice of reason, offering logical explanations for every strange occurrence. Her acknowledgement of the doll's activity represented a significant departure from her usual pragmatism. "What happened?" I asked, uncertain if I truly wanted to know. She sighed, her gaze fixed on the darkening yard. "The knocking returned about 2 months after you left. Always from your closet, always 3 distinct knocks followed by silence, then 3 more. I ignored it at first." She described how, after several weeks of this pattern, she had finally entered my room and opened the closet, finding the storage container exactly as I had left it. When she removed the lid, however, both dolls were positioned differently than I had placed them, sitting upright, facing the closet door as if waiting for it to open. "I told myself I was being foolish," she continued, "that you must have positioned them that way before leaving. But I know you didn't." What followed was a detailed account of increasingly disturbing events. My grandmother described finding the closet door open on multiple occasions, despite having closed it securely. She mentioned items in my room being rearranged, books removed from shelves, desk drawers partially opened, my bedspread disturbed as if someone had sat on its edge. "The last incident happened just 3 days before you came home," she said, her voice dropping to near a whisper. "I was awakened by what sounded like footsteps in your room. Light, careful steps moving from the closet to your bed and back again. I gathered my courage and opened your door without warning, turning on the light immediately." My grandmother's hands trembled slightly as she described what she had seen, the larger doll sitting on my pillow, the smaller one positioned at the foot of the bed. The storage container in the closet stood open, its lid on the floor beside it. "I convinced myself I must have checked the container earlier and forgotten to secure it properly," she said. "That perhaps the house settling had caused the dolls to fall into those positions. But deep down, I knew better." That night, after my grandmother had gone to bed, I approached my closet with determined steps. The time for avoidance had passed. I opened the door and knelt before the storage container, removing its lid slowly. Both dolls lay wrapped in tissue paper, positioned horizontally as one would expect. Nothing appeared unusual or disturbed. I unwrapped them carefully, examining each for signs of damage or alteration. Finding nothing, I made a decision. I placed both dolls on my dresser, positioning them side by side facing my bed. Then I took out my phone and opened a time-lapse recording application. I set the phone on my bookshelf, aimed toward the dresser, and programmed it to capture one frame every 30 seconds throughout the night. With this surveillance in place, I went to bed, leaving a small lamp illuminated to ensure the camera would capture any movement. Despite my exhaustion, sleep evaded me for hours as I periodically opened my eyes to check the dolls' positions. They remained motionless until I finally drifted off around 2 in the morning. The harsh sound of my alarm woke me at 7. Sunlight streamed through my curtains, casting the room in a warm glow that seemed to contradict the uneasiness I felt. My first glance confirmed what I both expected and dreaded. The dolls had moved. The larger one now stood at the edge of the dresser, its porcelain hand extended outward as if reaching toward my bed. The smaller doll had rotated completely, its back now facing the room. With trembling fingers, I retrieved my phone and opened the time-lapse recording. The footage began normally, showing the dolls positioned as I had left them. For the first 2 hours, nothing changed. Then, at approximately 1:42 a.m., according to the timestamp, the smaller doll's head rotated slowly, a movement that should have been physically impossible given its fixed porcelain construction. At 2:17 a.m., the larger doll began to move. Unlike the smaller one's subtle shift, this movement was more pronounced. It appeared to lift itself incrementally, using tiny, jerking motions to change its position until it stood at the dresser's edge, arm extended. The recording continued until morning, showing no further movement after the dolls reached the positions in which I found them. I replayed the footage 3 times, searching for signs of manipulation or natural explanation. Finding none, I was forced to confront the reality I had been avoiding for years. The dolls moved on their own. I am 24 now, sitting in my first solo apartment with both porcelain dolls displayed on a shelf across from my desk. After years of unexplained phenomena, I have reached an unusual arrangement with these inanimate yet somehow conscious objects. Following the recorded evidence of their movement, I spent months researching similar accounts, consulting with collectors of antique dolls, and even meeting discreetly with a paranormal investigator recommended by Rebecca. None provided satisfactory explanations for what I had experienced and documented. The paranormal investigator suggested the dolls might host attachments, spirits or energies bound to the physical objects for reasons unknown. She recommended destroying them to sever the connection. The doll collector warned that breaking porcelain dolls was considered deeply unlucky in multiple cultures, potentially releasing whatever essence they contained. My grandmother, in a surprising departure from her lifelong skepticism, suggested a third option. "They've never harmed you," she pointed out. "Their activities increase when you're absent or ignoring them, but remain relatively benign when you acknowledge their presence." This observation aligned with my own experiences. The most dramatic incidents had occurred during periods when I had stored the dolls away or left home for extended periods. When displayed openly and treated with a certain degree of acknowledgement, their activities diminished in frequency and intensity. So began our strange coexistence. I keep the dolls displayed prominently in whatever space I inhabit. Each morning, I acknowledge them verbally, a simple greeting that feels both ridiculous and necessary. When traveling, I inform them of my departure date and expected return, placing them in positions facing the door as if awaiting my return. In exchange, their movements have become more subtle and less frequent. Objects in my apartment remain undisturbed. The knocking has ceased entirely. Occasionally, I still find them in slightly altered positions, particularly after mentioning them to others or writing about them as I am doing now. As I complete this account, I notice the smaller doll has rotated slightly to face the computer screen. The larger one remains in position, though its hat has raised just enough to expose its glass eyes. I feel their attention focused on my words, perhaps curious about how their story will be told. I have accepted that I may never understand what animates these porcelain figures. Perhaps they contain energies beyond scientific explanation. Perhaps long years of projected emotions and fears have somehow manifested in physical movement. Perhaps there is a perfectly rational explanation that continues to elude me. What I know with certainty is that destroying them feels wrong, not merely out of superstition, but from a deeper sense that they are, in their way, attached to me as their caretaker. They have followed me through childhood into adulthood, witnessing my development with their unchanging porcelain faces. In strange moments of honesty with myself, I acknowledge that I would miss their presence if they were gone. So we continue our unusual relationship, these watching dolls and I. They remain mostly still when observed, coming alive in the periphery of my attention or during the unguarded hours of night. I maintain my rituals of acknowledgement, treating them with a respect that feels earned rather than irrational. Sometimes, in the darkest hours before dawn, I awaken to find the larger doll has moved closer to my bedside. Its painted face reveals nothing, but I sense something almost protective in its posture. As if having attached itself to me, it now stands guard against other, less familiar entities that might wish me harm. "Good morning," I say to them now as I prepare to end this writing session. "Thank you for letting me share your story." The air in my apartment feels momentarily heavy, then settles. Outside my window, the world continues its normal rhythms, unaware of the small, inexplicable reality we have created here. I save this document and close my laptop, turning to face my porcelain companions directly. Their glass eyes reflect the afternoon light, revealing nothing and everything about our shared history. I no longer fear what I don't understand. Some mysteries, I have learned, are best left unexamined too closely, respected from a careful distance, acknowledged but not disturbed. And so we watch each other, these dolls and I, neither fully understanding the other, but having reached a form of peace in our mutual observation. Sometimes I wonder who is really the watcher and who is being watched. Perhaps in the end, it doesn't matter. We have found our equilibrium in this strange, unspoken arrangement, and for now, that seems enough.